The Widow's Easter Miracle Promise, Chapter 1, Storm of Providence. I sat perched atop the wagon seat, my hands raw and chafed from weeks of holding the reins. The leather straps cut into my palms as I squinted up at the Montana sky, watching wisps of gray streaking across what had been, just hours before, a canopy of pristine blue. The air had changed, carrying that peculiar heaviness that preceded a storm, the kind that made your skin prickle with warning. Behind me, nestled among our remaining worldly possessions, Emma and James slept. 8-year-old Emma had curled her body protectively around her younger brother, her arm draped across his small chest. Even in sleep, she remained the watchful sister. The gentle rocking of the wagon had lulled them both into much-needed slumber after our morning of difficult travel. "Just a bit further," I whispered to the horses, Samson and Delilah, their once proud heads now hanging low with fatigue. "I know you're tired, old friends." The eastern Montana landscape stretched before us, all rolling hills and prairie grasses bent sideways by the strengthening wind, so different from our Illinois home with its familiar woodlands and neat farms. 4 months on the trail had changed us all. The children's faces had grown leaner, tanned by the unforgiving sun. My own hands no longer resembled those of the banker's wife I'd once been, now rough and strong from work that Thomas had never expected me to do. Tomos! His name still caught in my throat like a fishbone. Pneumonia had taken him so quickly last winter, leaving nothing behind but memories, 2 fatherless children, and debts that had forced the sale of nearly everything we owned. The bank had been kind enough in their way, allowing me 3 months to settle affairs before claiming our home, but kindness had its limits when money was involved. I reached inside my coat pocket, feeling for the folded letter that had become my talisman. The paper had gone soft at the creases from my constant handling, Cousin Martha's handwriting faded but still legible. "Come west," she'd written. "There's a place for you here. The school needs a teacher, and the land itself heals wounded hearts." I'd read those words so many times I could recite them in my sleep. That letter was our lifeline, our only hope for a future that held more than charity or my returning to my father's house as a widowed failure. A fat raindrop splashed against my cheek, jolting me from my thoughts. I glanced upward again, my stomach tightening. What had been distant clouds now loomed directly overhead, dark and swollen with moisture. The wind gusted harder, carrying the unmistakable scent of imminent downpour. "Mama?" Emma's voice drifted from the wagon bed, sleep-laden but tinged with worry. "Is it going to storm?" "Just a spring shower, sweetheart," I answered, forcing lightness into my tone. "Go back to sleep if you can." She didn't believe me. Emma rarely did when I attempted to soften the truth. But she settled back down without argument. At 8 years old, my daughter had already learned that questioning wouldn't change our circumstances. I slapped the reins against the horses' backs, urging them to quicken their plodding pace. The map I'd purchased in the last town had shown a settlement called Promise Creek lying somewhere ahead, though distances out here proved deceptive. What looked to be an hour's journey often stretched into 3 or more. The weathered signpost we'd passed that morning had claimed Promise Creek lay 15 miles ahead. If the horses could maintain even this tired pace, we might reach it before full darkness fell. "Come on, just a little faster," I coaxed, hearing the plea in my own voice. The horses' ears flicked backward at my words, but their pace remained unchanged. They had nothing more to give after pulling our wagon across streams and up countless inclines since daybreak. Another raindrop struck me, then another. The air had cooled considerably, raising gooseflesh along my arms beneath my woolen sleeves. I glanced at the narrow road ahead, already seeing spots where the dirt had darkened with moisture. If the rain came hard, as western storms were wont to do, the path would quickly turn to mud, perhaps becoming impassable until it dried again. I swallowed hard against the rising knot of fear. We couldn't afford another delay. Our supplies were stretched thin already, with barely enough flour and coffee to last the week. The paltry remains of Thomas's life insurance wouldn't sustain us beyond reaching Oregon. "The Lord is my shepherd," I whispered, the psalm my father had taught me as a child rising unbidden to my lips. "I shall not want." The words felt hollow now after months of wanting so much. wanting Thomas alive, wanting security for my children, wanting certainty in a world that offered none. Yet I clung to them nonetheless, a drowning woman grasping at floating debris. The first proper drops of rain began to fall in earnest now, pattering against the canvas cover of our wagon. I reached for the oilskin coat folded beside me, shrugging it over my shoulders as the wind picked up. The horses plodded onward, their hooves now splashing through puddles forming in the wheel ruts. Ahead, through the gathering gloom, a fork in the road appeared. The signpost that should have directed travelers had fallen, its weather-beaten planks lying face down in the mud. I pulled the horses to a halt, my heart sinking. Neither path looked more traveled than the other. "Lord, if you're listening," I murmured. A sign would be mighty welcome about now. As if in answer, lightning split the darkened sky, illuminating the landscape in stark relief. In that brief, brilliant moment, I glimpsed something in the distance to the right, the unmistakable angular shape of a building. I turned the team rightward without hesitation. A building meant people, and people meant shelter. Even if Promise Creek lay along the left fork, any haven from the coming deluge would have to suffice. Rain began falling in sheets now, drumming against the wagon canvas with such force that I could scarcely hear Emma when she called out to me again. "I'm frightened, Mama." Her small face appeared at my elbow as she crawled forward from the wagon bed. "I know, sweet girl," I said, pulling her close against my side with one arm while maintaining my grip on the reins with the other. "But we'll find shelter soon. See there?" I nodded toward where I'd seen the building, though it remained invisible now in the downpour. "We're heading toward a house or a barn. We'll be dry before you know it." "What about James?" she asked, ever mindful of her brother. "He's still sleeping," I assured her, knowing my son could slumber through nearly anything. That boy would sleep through Gabriel's trumpet on Judgment Day. The comment earned me a small smile, which I counted as victory enough for the moment. Emma settled against me, her small body shivering slightly despite the heavy quilt she'd wrapped around her shoulders. We pressed forward through the strengthening storm, the horses struggling now as the wheels sank deeper into the softening earth. Each flash of lightning revealed we were indeed approaching a structure, not just one building, but several, the unmistakable silhouette of a ranch taking shape through the curtain of rain. Whether this was providence or mere chance, I couldn't say, but as another psalm rose to my lips, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death," I allowed myself to hope that perhaps, just perhaps, our long journey had finally led us to sanctuary. The rain began as a gentle patter against the canvas, almost musical in its rhythm. I tilted my face skyward, letting a few drops splash against my cheeks. In another time, another life, I might have found beauty in this moment. The vast Montana sky darkening to indigo, the distant mountains disappearing behind veils of mist. But beauty was a luxury I could ill afford when shelter remained elusive and nightfall approached. Within minutes, that gentle patter transformed into a roaring assault. The heavens opened without mercy, unleashing sheets of water that struck the wagon with such force I could scarcely hear my own thoughts. My sodden bonnet sagged against my forehead, sending rivulets of cold water down my neck and beneath my collar. "Giddy up!" I shouted, my voice lost in the downpour. I snapped the reins harder than I intended, desperation making me rough where I'd always been gentle. Poor Samson and Delilah labored forward, their hooves lifting with sickening, sucking sounds as the road beneath us transformed to mud. Thunder cracked directly overhead, a sound so violent it seemed to split the air itself. The horses reared in panic, nearly jerking the reins from my raw hands. "Whoa there," I called, struggling to calm them while keeping us moving forward. "Steady now," from within the wagon came a frightened cry. James had awakened, his usual stoicism shattered by the storm's fury. At 6 years old, he tried so hard to be the man of the family, but in this moment he was simply a terrified little boy. "Mama?" Emma's voice joined his, high and tremulous. "Stay inside, children," I commanded, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Keep yourselves covered!" Another flash of lightning illuminated the landscape in stark white brilliance, followed almost instantly by thunder that shook the very frame of our wagon. The horses whinnied in terror, straining against their harnesses. "Mama!" James's wail tore at my heart. I heard rustling behind me as my children scrambled toward the front of the wagon. "Stay back," I called, but it was too late. Emma's face appeared beside me, her blue eyes wide with fear. James crowded next to her, his small body shaking. "I thought the sky was breaking," he whispered, clutching his sister's arm. I couldn't spare a hand to comfort them, not with the rains requiring every ounce of my strength and attention. "It's just a storm, sweetheart. The thunder sounds frightful, but it can't hurt us." Even as the words left my mouth, I knew they rang hollow. This was no ordinary spring shower. The road ahead had disappeared entirely beneath a rushing sheet of muddy water. What had been wheel ruts were now miniature rivers, cutting deeper with each passing moment. "The horses are scared," Emma observed, her voice steadier than I expected. Always my practical child, seeing clearly what others missed. "They'll be fine once we reach shelter," I assured her, though my certainty was mere pretense. I peered through the curtain of rain, trying to glimpse the buildings I'd seen earlier. They had to be close now. The wagon lurched suddenly as the right wheel sank into an unseen hole. The children tumbled against me, and I barely kept my seat, one arm flung protectively across them. "Back inside," I ordered, my tone brooking no argument. "Wrap yourselves in the quilts and stay low." For once, they obeyed without protest, scurrying back into the relative safety of the wagon bed. I heard Emma murmuring comforting words to James, taking on my role as I couldn't leave the reins. Precious minutes crawled by as we inched forward. The horses strained against the increasing resistance, their powerful shoulders heaving with effort. The rain showed no sign of abating. If anything, it fell with greater intensity, driven sideways now by gusting wind that threatened to tear the canvas covering from its frame. "Just a little farther," I encouraged the team, though I couldn't see more than 10 feet ahead through the deluge. My clothes were soaked through, clinging to my skin with clammy insistence. Shivers racked my body, my fingers so numb I could barely feel the reins. We crested a small rise in the road, and through a momentary break in the rainfall, I glimpsed our destination. A substantial ranch house with outbuildings, perhaps half a mile distant. Relief flooded through me, as warming as a shot of whiskey. "Children, I see it," I called back to them. "A ranch, not far now." Their answering cheers bolstered my flagging spirits. We would make it. We had to. The wagon began its careful descent down the slope, moving faster now with the aid of gravity. Too fast. I pulled back on the reins, trying to slow our progress as the wheels began to slide in the mud rather than roll. "Whoa, easy now," I urged the horses, feeling the wagon sway dangerously behind them. The sound came without warning, a sickening crack that reverberated through the wagon frame, followed by a lurch that nearly threw me from my seat. The wagon tilted sharply to the left, everything within it sliding toward the lower side. "Mama!" Emma and James cried in unison, their voices sharp with terror. "Hold on!" I shouted, dropping the reins and clutching the seat with both hands as the wagon came to an abrupt, tilted stop. The horses stamped in confusion, sensing the change but unable to see what had happened. I knew without looking. The strain had been too much for our well-worn wagon. The left axle had snapped clean through. For a long moment, I sat frozen, rain pelting my face, as the full impact of our situation washed over me. We were stranded in an unfamiliar wilderness, in a raging storm, with night approaching and no help in sight. The ranch I'd spotted might as well have been in another territory for all the good it did us now. My children's frightened faces appeared at the front opening of the wagon cover. "Stay inside," I commanded, finding my voice at last. "I need to check the damage." "But Mama," Emma began. "No arguments," I cut her off more sharply than I intended. Softening my tone, I added, "I need you to watch James. I'll only be a moment." Gathering what remained of my courage, I eased myself off the seat, clinging to the side of the wagon to keep from slipping. My feet found the wheel hub, then empty air before plunging ankle-deep into cold, sucking mud. The shock of it stole my breath. I clung to the wagon's side, steadying myself against the tilt and the treacherous footing. Water coursed around my ankles, soaking through my boots in seconds. With careful steps, I made my way to the source of our disaster. One glance confirmed my fears. The left axle had snapped completely, the wheel now resting at an impossible angle. The wagon bed had settled into the mud, its contents surely in disarray. This was no simple repair, not something I could fix with rope and determination. I stood there in the mud, rain streaming down my face, mingling with tears I hadn't realized I'd shed. We had come so far, endured so much, only to be defeated by an axle that had weathered one too many mountain passes. "Mama?" Emma called, her voice small against the storm's roar. "How bad is it?" I turned toward my children, seeing their worried faces peering from the wagon cover. In that moment, I wanted nothing more than to crumple into the mud and surrender to despair. But their eyes held mine, trusting, waiting for the reassurance only a mother could provide. I squared my shoulders, ignored the cold seeping into my bones, and forced confidence into my voice. "It's just the axle," I called back. "We can't go farther tonight, but we'll find help in the morning." The lie tasted bitter on my tongue. In truth, I had no idea how we would find help, or if anyone would pass this way once the storm cleared. But my children needed hope, and so I would give it to them, even if I had none left for myself. I sloshed back to the front of the wagon, my sodden skirts weighing me down like anchor chains. As I reached for the harness to calm the nervous horses, lightning split the sky once more. In that brilliant flash, I saw him, a rider, silhouetted against the stormy horizon, moving toward us through the rain. I stood in the deluge, clutching the wagon for support when the silhouetted rider materialized like an apparition through the rain-soaked gloom. At first, I wondered if desperation had conjured him from my imagination, a phantom of hope in our darkest hour. But the splash of hooves through muddy water and the distinctive outline of a man atop a sturdy horse proved solid enough. The stranger approached cautiously, his mount picking a careful path through the flooded terrain. Lightning flashed again, illuminating a tall figure in a rain-slicked duster, hat pulled low against the downpour. Something in his posture, the rigid spine, the squared shoulders, spoke of wariness that matched my own. "Hello, the wagon," he called, his voice carrying surprisingly clear through the storm's cacophony. I straightened my spine, acutely aware of my bedraggled appearance, hair plastered to my cheeks, skirts caked with mud to the knees. Pride was a foolish indulgence in such circumstances, yet I couldn't help but wish I might have met this potential savior with some semblance of dignity and tact. "We've had an accident," I called back, gesturing toward the broken axle. "The wagon can't be moved." He guided his horse closer, close enough that I could make out his features beneath the dripping brim of his hat, a stern face, all angles and shadows, with eyes that assessed our predicament with cool efficiency. Not a young man, but not old either. Perhaps 30 or so, with a weathered quality that spoke of a life lived outdoors. "Ma'am," he acknowledged with a curt nod. "Ethan Hayes, this is my property you're stranded on." "Sarah Caldwell," I replied, fighting to keep my teeth from chattering. "These are my children, Emma and James." As if on cue, their small faces appeared at the wagon opening, wide-eyed and solemn as they regarded the stranger. Emma, ever protective, had one arm around her younger brother's shoulders. Something flickered across Ethan Hayes' face. A moment of discomfort or perhaps recognition before his expression hardened again into impassive assessment. "You're a fair piece from town," he observed, dismounting with practiced ease despite the treacherous footing. His boots sank into the mud almost to his ankles, yet he moved with the sure-footed confidence of a man accustomed to navigating difficult terrain. "Didn't anyone warn you about these spring storms?" "We're passing through," I explained, conscious of how my voice wavered with cold. "Heading to Oregon, to my cousin's homestead, the storm caught us unawares." He circled the wagon, inspecting the damage with a critical eye. Rain streamed from his duster in small waterfalls as he crouched by the broken axle. "This can't be fixed without proper tools and a new axle," he pronounced, straightening. "Town's 15 miles east. Creek between here and there will be running high after this downpour." He glanced skyward, his frown deepening. "No crossing it for at least a day or two." My heart sank. "We can make camp here until—" "In this?" He cut me off with a sharp gesture toward the sky, which answered with another deafening crack of thunder. "That'd be pure foolishness, ma'am. You'd all catch your death." I bit back a retort, knowing he spoke only the truth. Already I could feel a bone-deep chill setting in, and the children's faces had taken on a pinched, pale quality that frightened me far more than our broken wagon. Mr. Hayes regarded us for a long moment, conflict evident in the tight line of his mouth and the furrow between his brows. I recognized the look of a man calculating the cost of charity, weighing the inconvenience against his conscience. "My ranch is just over that rise," he finally said, each word seeming dragged from him reluctantly. "You can shelter there until the creek subsides and your wagon can be repaired." Relief washed through me with such force that my knees nearly buckled. "That's most kind of you, Mr. Hayes." "It's not kindness, ma'am. It's common decency." His tone made it clear he viewed this as obligation rather than choice. No one would leave a woman and children stranded in such weather. Many would, I thought, but did not say. The world had proven far less charitable than Mr. Hayes suggested since Tomas's passing. "Emma, James," I called, turning toward the wagon. "Gather only what we need for tonight. Mr. Hayes is offering us shelter until our wagon can be fixed." "Can I bring my book, Mama?" Emma asked, her small voice steadier now that help had arrived. "Yes, and one for James, too. Bring our night things and the medicine bundle." While the children collected our essentials, Mr. Hayes secured his horse to our wagon and helped harness our team to his mount. "Your horse can pull them all?" I asked, eyeing his sturdy but not overly large bay gelding. "Ajax is stronger than he looks," Hayes replied with what might have been a touch of pride, "and it's not far." When the children had assembled a small bundle of necessities, Hayes lifted first James, then Emma onto his horse, positioning them securely before turning to me. "Can you ride astride, Mrs. Caldwell?" he asked, the practical question nevertheless bringing heat to my cheeks. "I can," I answered, grateful the darkness hid my discomfort. Riding astride was something I'd done as a girl on my father's farm, never as a married woman, certainly never in the presence of a stranger. He offered his cupped hands as a mounting assist without further comment. I gathered my sodden skirts as modestly as possible and placed my boot in his palms, finding myself swung upward with surprising ease. I settled behind the children, acutely aware of the impropriety of our arrangement, yet too practical to protest what necessity demanded. "Hold tight," Hayes instructed, taking Ajax's reins and leading us forward through the storm on foot. We moved slowly through the darkness, the rain gradually subsiding to a steady drizzle. The children huddled against me, their small bodies trembling with cold and excitement. James, ever curious despite our circumstances, peppered Mr. Hayes with questions. "Is your ranch big, sir?" he asked, his voice carrying in the momentary quiet between thunderclaps. "Big enough," came the terse reply. "Do you have cattle?" "Pa always wanted cattle," James continued, undeterred by Hayes's brevity. "James," I cautioned, "Mr. Hayes is kind enough to help us. Don't pester him with questions." Hayes glanced back, his expression unreadable in the darkness. "It's no trouble, ma'am. Yes, boy, I run about 100 head of cattle. Some horses, too." James's delight was palpable, but Emma remained silent, watchful. My daughter had grown wary of strangers since her father's death, her childhood trust replaced by a premature guardedness that ached to witness. As we crested the rise, lightning illuminated the landscape once more, revealing a tidy homestead nestled in a protected hollow. A substantial log house formed the centerpiece, with a barn and several outbuildings arranged nearby. Even through the rain, I could see this was no rough bachelor accommodation, but a well-established ranch, speaking of years of careful work. "Evergreen Ranch," Hayes said, following my gaze. "My parents started it, been here 20 years now." I heard the pride in his voice and something else, a weight to the words that suggested more history than he cared to share. We approached the main house, a welcoming light glowing from one window despite the late hour. Hayes helped us dismount before the covered porch, his hands impersonal but gentle as he lifted the children down. "I need to see to the animals," he said. "Go on inside and get yourselves warm. Fire's lit in the main room." I hesitated at the threshold. "Mr. Hayes, I want to be clear that we won't impose on you longer than absolutely necessary. As soon as the creek subsides and your wagon's fixed, you'll be on your way." He finished for me, his tone making it clear he expected exactly that. "I understand, Mrs. Caldwell, this is temporary." Something in his emphatic assurance stung, though I had no right to feel slighted. This man owed us nothing, had already offered more than many would. "Of course," I replied, my chin lifting slightly. "We're grateful for your hospitality, however brief. Our eyes met for a moment, and I caught something like surprise in his gaze, perhaps at my dignity despite our bedraggled state, or possibly at the firmness in my tone. Whatever it was, it disappeared quickly behind the mask of polite detachment he wore. "There are towels inside," he said, gesturing toward the door, "and blankets in the chest by the hearth. Make yourselves comfortable. I'll be in shortly." With that, he turned away, leading his horse toward the barn, his shoulders set against more than just the lingering rain. I watched him go, this reluctant Good Samaritan who had rescued us from disaster, yet clearly wished the necessity had never arisen. Pride warred with gratitude in my breast. We needed his help desperately, yet I chafed at dependence on a stranger's charity, especially one who offered it with such obvious reluctance. "Mama, I'm cold," James whispered, his small hand finding mine. His touch grounded me, reminding me that pride was a luxury my children could ill afford. I squeezed his fingers reassuringly. "Then let's get inside and warm you up," I said, pushing open the door to Ethan Hayes' home, stepping across a threshold that would change all our lives in ways I couldn't possibly imagine. The warmth of Ethan Hayes' home enveloped us as we stepped across the threshold, the contrast to the biting cold outside so stark that I gasped involuntarily. A fire crackled in a large stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across a spacious main room that spoke of comfort if not tidiness. My gaze traveled over the scattered evidence of a solitary male existence. A pair of mud-caked boots tossed beside the door, newspapers stacked haphazardly on a side table, a coffee cup abandoned on the mantel. The furnishings themselves were sturdy and well-crafted, a oak dining table large enough to seat 8, a leather armchair worn smooth at the armrests, bookshelves lined with volumes whose spines showed the telltale creases of actual reading. "Mama, look," Emma whispered, pointing toward a patchwork quilt draped over the back of a rocking chair. "Like grandmother used to make," I nodded, noting the intricate pattern and careful stitching. A woman's touch in this otherwise masculine domain. Not recent work, I guessed, but preserved with evident care. James had already gravitated toward the fire, his small hands extended toward the flames. His face, pale with cold moments before, now glowed in the firelight. "It's so warm," he marveled, as though heat were some newly discovered miracle. I set our meager bundle of belongings on a nearby bench and began to unwind my sodden shawl. "Don't stand too close, James, and mind you don't drip on Mr. Hayes' floor." Too late, puddles had already formed beneath each of us, our clothing so saturated that no amount of careful wringing would prevent the water's escape. I glanced around for the towels Hayes had mentioned and spotted a stack of folded linens on a chest near the hearth. "Here," I said, passing towels to the children. "Dry yourselves as best you can." As I helped James towel his damp hair, the door opened again, admitting a gust of cool air and our reluctant host. Hayes had shed his duster somewhere between the barn and house, revealing a sturdy frame clad in a simple flannel shirt and denims. His dark hair, damp from the rain, curled slightly at his collar, and his beard, neatly trimmed but substantial, framed a mouth set in what I was beginning to recognize as a habitual line of stern contemplation. "Animals are settled," he announced, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. His gaze swept over us, lingering briefly on the puddles we'd created. If he was annoyed, he gave no sign beyond a slight tightening around his eyes. "You should get the young ones into dry clothes before they catch their death." "Yes, of course," I agreed, gathering our bundle again. "Is there somewhere we might—" His expression flickered with what might have been embarrassment. "This way," he said, leading us down a short hallway off the main room. He opened a door, revealing a modestly sized bedroom with a large bed neatly made up with fresh linens. A smaller trundle bed had been pulled from beneath it, also made up with blankets and a pillow. "My parents' room," he said, his voice gruff. "No one's used it in years, but it's clean enough." I surveyed the room with its heavy oak furnishings and faded floral wallpaper. Feminine touches still lingered. A crocheted doily on the dressing table, a porcelain water pitcher and basin adorned with hand-painted violets, a small cushioned stool before the mirror. The contrast with the bachelor disarray of the main room couldn't have been more pronounced. "It's lovely," I said, genuine appreciation in my voice. "Your mother had fine taste." Hayes shifted uncomfortably. "She liked pretty things," he acknowledged, then gestured to a door in the corner. "There's a washroom through there, Pump works if you need water." He moved to the window, checking that it was securely latched against the storm. "I'll leave you to get settled." With that, he retreated, pulling the door closed behind him with careful precision. I released a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, the tension in my shoulders easing slightly now that we were alone. "Can we sleep in that big bed, Mama?" James asked, eyeing it with undisguised longing. "Yes, you and Emma will share it tonight," I told him, already rummaging in our bundle for their night clothes. "Where will you sleep?" Emma asked, ever practical. "On the trundle, sweetheart." I handed her a clean nightgown, marveling that it had somehow remained dry inside our waterproofed pack. "Now change quickly while I fetch water for washing." The pump in the small washroom produced clear, cold water with a metallic tang that spoke of deep wells. I filled the basin, grateful for this small luxury after weeks of washing in streams and rivers. By the time I returned, both children had changed and were sitting expectantly on the edge of the large bed. "Hands and faces," I instructed, setting the basin between them. Then teeth, as they performed their ablutions with minimal complaint, a testament to their exhaustion. I changed into my own nightdress behind a small privacy screen in the corner, draping my sodden clothing over its edge in hopes it might dry by morning. "Will we leave tomorrow, Mama?" Emma asked as I tucked the quilts around them moments later. I smoothed her damp hair from her forehead. "I don't think so, dear heart. The wagon needs repairs, and Mr. Hayes says the creek is too high to cross. We'll likely be here a few days." "Is that bad?" James yawned, his eyes already heavy-lidded. "No, not bad," I assured him, though uncertainty gnawed at me. "Just a small delay in our journey. Mr. Hayes is kind to shelter us from the storm." "He doesn't smile much," Emma observed with a child's directness. "Not everyone wears their feelings on their face, Emma. Now, close your eyes. Morning comes early, and I'm sure Mr. Hayes will have chores that need doing." I sang them a lullaby, one my mother had sung to me in childhood, soft and low so as not to disturb our host. Within minutes, their breathing deepened into sleep, the day's adventures finally giving way to exhaustion. For a long moment, I sat beside them, watching the gentle rise and fall of their small chests, struck anew by their fragility and my tremendous responsibility. What would Thomas think of me now, leading his children into the wilderness with nothing but determination and a cousin's promise to sustain us? The thought brought a familiar ache to my chest, not the sharp, unbearable pain of fresh grief, but the dull, persistent throb of absence that I suspected would never fully heal. The rumble of my stomach reminded me that none of us had eaten since noon. I rose quietly, tucking the quilts more securely around my sleeping children, and made my way back to the main room. Hayes sat at the kitchen table, a steaming mug between his hands. A second mug waited at the place opposite him, its fragrant steam carrying the rich aroma of fresh coffee. A modest plate of biscuits and cold ham sat between the cups. "Thought you might be hungry," he said as I hesitated in the doorway, suddenly conscious of my state of dress. Though my nightgown was perfectly modest, covered as it was by a thick wool wrapper, I felt exposed before this stranger in a way I hadn't since Thomas's passing. "That's very thoughtful, thank you," I said, taking the seat across from him and reaching gratefully for the coffee. The first sip spread warmth through my chest, and I couldn't suppress a small sigh of appreciation. Real coffee, what a luxury. "You've been without?" he asked, something like curiosity breaking through his reserve. "We've been making do with chicory for weeks," I admitted. "Proper coffee was one of the first luxuries we sacrificed for the journey." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. Every settler knew the hierarchies of necessity, what could be kept, what must be left behind. "The children are asleep?" he asked, breaking a biscuit in half. "Yes, poor dears are exhausted." I accepted a portion of ham he offered, the salt and smoke flavors almost overwhelming after our bland trail fare. "Mr. Hayes, I want to thank you properly for taking us in. I don't know what we would have done otherwise." He dismissed my gratitude with a slight shake of his head. "Anyone would have done the same." "Not anyone," I corrected gently, "and not with such thoroughness. The room is lovely. It was kind of you to prepare the trundle bed." His gaze remained fixed on his coffee. "Seemed better than making you sleep on the floor after the day you've had." We lapsed into silence, the only sounds the persistent drumming of rain on the roof and the occasional pop from the fireplace as a log settled. It wasn't a comfortable silence, too many unasked questions hung in the air between us, but neither was it entirely unpleasant. "About tomorrow," I began, setting my empty cup aside. "The wagon will need to wait until the storm passes," he interrupted. "Even then, the axle requires parts from town. Creek won't be passable for at least 2 days if this rain keeps up." "I understand," I said, folding my hands in my lap. "Please know we'll be gone as soon as possible. I wouldn't dream of imposing on your hospitality longer than absolutely necessary." Something flashed in his eyes. Irritation? Regret? It passed too quickly to name. "It's no imposition," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "You and your children are welcome to shelter here until your wagon is repaired and the way is clear." "That's very generous," I said, hearing the formality in my own voice. "We'll endeavor to earn our keep while we're here. I'm handy with cooking and mending, and the children can help with simple chores." He nodded, his expression inscrutable. "They'll do fine." The conversation exhausted, we finished our small meal in silence. When the last biscuit had been consumed and the coffee had grown cold in our cups, Hayes rose. "Dawn comes early," he said, collecting the dishes and depositing them in a basin of water. "I'll be out to check the cattle at first light. Don't eat breakfast on my account. Kitchen's at your disposal." "Thank you, Mr. Hayes. Good night." He nodded once, retreating to what I presumed was his own bedroom off the main room, closing the door with a decisive click. I lingered at the table, listening to the rhythm of the rain, feeling the weight of uncertainty pressing down upon me. Where did this detour leave us? Our supplies were limited, our funds even more so. Every day delayed was a day's provisions consumed with no forward progress to show for it, yet beneath the practical concerns lurked a deeper unease. This man, this stranger who had taken us into his home, who was he really? The evidence of his life surrounded me. The books suggesting an educated mind, the quality of furnishings speaking of relative prosperity, the careful preservation of his parents' room indicating sentimentality at odds with his gruff exterior. But the man himself remained a cipher, his reluctant charity raising more questions than it answered. Eventually, I made my way back to the bedroom, settling onto the trundle beside my sleeping children. The mattress was surprisingly comfortable, the linens smelling faintly of cedar and sunshine, stored carefully, then aired before our arrival. Another small kindness from our reluctant host. Sleep eluded me as I lay listening to the storm's fury gradually subsiding to a gentle patter against the window panes. Somewhere in this same house, I suspected Ethan Hayes also lay awake, perhaps already regretting his impulse of charity, wondering what complications we would bring to his solitary existence. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, of that I was certain, but for tonight at least, we were dry, warm, and safe. Providence had led us to this haven, however temporary it might prove. As my eyelids finally grew heavy, I offered a silent prayer of gratitude, mixing with it a plea for guidance in the days to come. Chapter 2. Uneasy Sanctuary. Dawn broke with tentative fingers of light slipping through the curtains, rousing me from fitful slumber. For a disorienting moment, I couldn't place the unfamiliar weight of the quilt or the cedar-scented pillow beneath my cheek. Then memory returned. The storm, the broken wagon, the reluctant sanctuary of Ethan Hayes' home. I rose quietly, careful not to disturb Emma and James, who remained cocooned in their borrowed bed, faces peaceful in sleep. A glance at the small mantel clock revealed it was barely past 5, yet habit had me fully awake. On the trail, Dawn had been our constant companion and taskmaster. After dressing hastily in my still damp clothing, I slipped from the bedroom into the silent house. The main room stood empty, the embers in the hearth glowing faintly amid a bed of ash. A chill hung in the air, the storm having passed during the night to leave behind that peculiar stillness that follows nature's tantrums. In the kitchen, evidence of bachelor living lay in plain sight. Unwashed coffee cups stacked haphazardly beside a basin of cloudy water, crumbs scattered across the wooden table, and a cast-iron skillet bearing the crusty remains of several previous meals. Without conscious decision, I rolled up my sleeves and set to work. The pump by the sink yielded fresh water with a few firm strokes, cold enough to sting my hands as I filled the kettle and set it on the stove. The wood box beside it held plenty of split pine, and soon a cheerful blaze danced beneath the kettle. While waiting for the water to heat, I tackled the dishes, scouring each with sand and a sliver of lye soap I found on the shelf. Methodically, I restored order to the kitchen, finding satisfaction in each surface that emerged gleaming from beneath neglect. A creature of habit, Mr. Hayes had at least organized his pantry with reasonable care. Flour and sugar in lidded crocks, coffee beans in a tin, salt pork hanging from a hook, and a basket of eggs that looked reasonably fresh. By the time pale sunlight streamed through the eastern window, I had bread dough rising beneath a cloth, coffee brewing on the stove, and biscuits browning in the oven. The simple domesticity of these tasks soothed my frayed nerves, giving me purpose in this place where I was neither guest nor rightful occupant. The sound of a door opening snapped my attention toward the hallway. Ethan Hayes stood framed in the doorway to his bedroom, dressed in work clothes, his dark hair still rumpled from sleep. His expression as he surveyed his transformed kitchen cycled rapidly from surprise to confusion to something unreadable. "Good morning, Mr. Hayes," I greeted him, suddenly self-conscious about the liberties I'd taken. "I hope you don't mind. I thought to make breakfast before the children wake." He approached the stove, drawn by the aroma of fresh coffee. "You didn't need to do all this," he said, but the appreciative way his gaze lingered on the pot belied his words. "It's the least I can do, given your hospitality," I replied, pouring a cup and offering it to him. "Black, I presume?" A flicker of surprise crossed his features as he accepted the cup. "Yes," he confirmed, taking a cautious sip. His eyes widened slightly. "This is good." "My father insisted on proper coffee," I explained, turning back to check the biscuits. "He claimed a man's character could be judged by how he brewed his morning cup." "Your father sounds like a sensible man," Hayes remarked, settling at the now clean table. I smiled despite myself. He had his moments of wisdom between bouts of stubborn foolishness. Hayes's mouth quirked, not quite a smile, but a softening of his habitually stern expression. "Sounds like most men I've known." Steam rose as I removed the biscuits from the oven, their golden tops promising flaky layers within. The familiar task transported me briefly to a different kitchen, a different life, where Thomas would have already been seated at the table, newspaper in hand, while the children tumbled in with sleep-tousled hair and eager appetites. "Something smells wonderful." James's voice shattered my reverie as he bounded into the kitchen, still in his nightshirt, hair sticking up at odd angles. Emma followed more sedately, already dressed, her hair neatly plaited though missing its usual ribbon. Hayes stiffened visibly at this sudden invasion of his quiet morning, his shoulders squaring as if preparing for an assault. "James Caldwell, where are your clothes?" I scolded gently. "Go dress properly before coming to the table." "But Mama, I'm hungry, and it smells so good," he protested, his gaze fixed longingly on the biscuits cooling on the sideboard. "Clothes first," I insisted, pointing him back toward the bedroom. "Proper manners matter even more when we're guests." With a dramatic sigh that only a 6-year-old could muster, James trudged back to the bedroom, his bare feet slapping against the wooden floor. "I apologize for the interruption to your morning, Mr. Hayes," I said, feeling heat rise to my cheeks. "The children are usually better mannered." Hayes cleared his throat awkwardly. "No need for apologies. It's been a while since children were in this house." Emma, who had been standing quietly by the doorway, stepped forward. "May I help set the table, Mama?" "Yes, thank you, Emma." I directed her to the drawer containing cutlery. "Set 4 places, please." As Emma carefully arranged forks and knives with solemn concentration, Hayes watched her with an odd expression, something between wariness and fascination, as if she were some exotic creature he'd never encountered before. "Do you keep cattle, Mr. Hayes?" Emma asked suddenly, glancing up at him with genuine curiosity. "I do," he answered, seeming surprised by her interest. "About 100 head of Herefords." "Papa always said Herefords were the best beef cattle for our climate," Emma remarked, placing the last fork with precision. "He wanted to buy some, but the bank wouldn't lend him enough for a proper start." A shadow crossed Hayes's face at the mention of her father. "Your papa was right. They winter well here, better than most breeds." James reappeared, thankfully dressed this time, though his shirt remained untucked on one side. "Do you have horses too? I love horses. Papa let me ride his gelding sometimes, though Mama worried I'd fall." James, I cautioned, Mr. Hayes hasn't even had his breakfast yet. Don't badger him with questions. It's all right, Hayes said, surprising me. Yes, boy, I keep horses. 8 of them currently, 2 teams for field work, my riding horse, and a few others. James's eyes widened with excitement. 8 whole horses? Can I see them? Can I help feed them? I'm real good with animals, honest. A bemused expression settled on Hayes's features as the barrage of questions continued through breakfast. James wanted to know everything about ranch life, how many acres Hayes owned, what crops he planted, how he managed the cattle during winter storms. Each question received a response that, while still brief, grew progressively more detailed and patient. Emma contributed occasional questions of her own, each carefully considered in contrast to her brother's enthusiastic stream of consciousness. Do you grow vegetables, Mr. Hayes? She asked as she delicately buttered a biscuit. I noticed the patch of turned earth behind the house. My mother kept a kitchen garden, he replied, something softening in his tone. I've kept it going, though, not as well as she did. Perhaps we could help with that, Emma suggested shyly, to earn our keep while we're here. I'm good with plants. Mama says I have grandmother's green thumb. That's a kind offer, Miss Emma, Hayes responded, using her name for the first time. The formal address brought a pleased flush to my daughter's cheeks. As the meal progressed, I observed a gradual easing in Hayes's posture, the rigid set of his shoulders relaxing incrementally with each passing minute. By the time we'd finished the last of the biscuits and eggs, he'd answered at least 24 questions from James, accepted a second cup of coffee from my hands without awkwardness, and even asked Emma whether she preferred flowers or vegetables in her gardens. We should check your wagon today, he said to me as the children helped clear the dishes. See what can be salvaged and what needs replacing. Of course, I agreed, grateful for his practical approach. The sooner we understand the damage, the sooner we can make plans to continue our journey. Something flickered across his face. Resignation, perhaps? Or possibly relief? The children can stay here. There are simple chores they could help with, if they are of a mind to. Oh, please, Mama, James exclaimed, nearly dropping the plate he was carrying to the basin. I want to help with the horses. And I could tidy the garden beds, Emma added with more restraint, though her eyes shone with equal enthusiasm. I glanced at Hayes, uncertain whether these offers truly aligned with his wishes or if he was merely being polite. The boy can help my ranch hand, Miguel, with the morning feeding, he said, correctly interpreting my concern. And the garden could use a woman's touch, or a girl's. This last was directed at Emma, whose serious expression brightened considerably. With breakfast concluded and the kitchen returned to order, Hayes and I prepared to ride out to the wagon while the children received instructions for their respective tasks. As I donned my still damp coat, I caught Hayes looking at the freshly cleaned kitchen with an expression of bemused appreciation. Thank you, he said quietly so the children wouldn't hear. For breakfast. It's been a long while since this kitchen saw proper cooking. The simple gratitude in his voice caught me off guard. You're welcome, Mr. Hayes. It truly is the least I can do. For a brief moment, something like understanding passed between us. 2 souls navigating unexpected circumstances with whatever grace we could muster. Then he cleared his throat and turned away. The moment broken as he called final instructions to Miguel about watching over James. The morning air carried the fresh, washed scent peculiar to landscapes recently drenched by storms, a mingling of damp earth, pine, and that indefinable sweetness that follows rain. Puddles dotted the yard, reflecting the clear blue sky overhead that gave no hint of yesterday's tempest. Hayes had saddled 2 horses, his own bay gelding and a gentle-eyed chestnut mare for me. As I settled into the saddle, adjusting my skirts for modesty as best I could, I gave silent thanks for my father's insistence that his daughters learn to ride properly. The side saddle Thomas had preferred for me on our Sunday rides would have been impractical on these mountain trails. You sit a horse well, Hayes observed as we set out, the morning sun warm against our backs. My father believed every farm girl should ride as well as she could cook, I replied, running a hand down the mare's sleek neck. What's her name? Penny, he answered. My mother's horse. Doesn't get ridden enough these days. I sensed the unspoken history in that simple statement, but didn't press. Some wounds were better left undisturbed. We rode in companionable silence for a time, the only sounds our horses' hooves against the muddy track and birdsong from the surrounding pines. After several minutes, we crested the hill where we'd first encountered each other, and I caught sight of our wagon, listing forlornly where we'd abandoned it. Even from a distance, I could see that the rain had not been kind to our belongings. The canvas covering had partially collapsed on one side, allowing water to pool and then seep into the wagon bed. Hayes dismounted first when we reached the wagon, then extended a hand to help me down. His touch was impersonal, yet sure, his calloused palm rough against my fingers. I stepped carefully, mindful of the treacherous footing, but still slipped slightly in the mud. Hayes's grip tightened reflexively, steadying me until I found solid ground. "Thank you," I murmured, withdrawing my hand perhaps too quickly. Propriety had little place in wilderness survival, yet old habits lingered. He nodded once, already turning his attention to the damaged wagon. Circling it slowly, he assessed the broken axle with a practiced eye. "Oak snapped clean through," he observed, crouching to examine the brake more closely. "Been weakening for some time, most likely. These hairline cracks here." He traced a finger along the wood. "They've been forming a while." I joined him, peering at the damage. "Can it be repaired?" "Not mended, no. You'll need a new axle altogether." He straightened, wiping mud from his hands. "That means town, and supplies." "How soon can we get there?" I asked, trying to keep the anxiety from my voice. Instead of answering directly, Hayes gestured eastward. "Come, see for yourself." We walked a short distance through mud that sucked at our boots with each step until we reached a point where the land sloped downward. Below us lay what had yesterday been a modest creek but had transformed overnight into a rushing torrent, its muddy waters swollen nearly to the tops of its banks. "Sweet, merciful heaven," I breathed, watching as a fallen tree branch was swept downstream with alarming speed. "Creek's the only way to town," Hayes explained, hands resting on his hips as he surveyed the flooded waterway. "No crossing that for days, not even on horseback." "Days?" I echoed, my heart sinking. "A week, most likely. Maybe more if we get another storm." His tone was matter-of-fact, neither apologetic nor pleased. "Spring runoff from the mountains combined with yesterday's cloudburst. Happens every year, though, not usually this early." I stared at the churning water, calculating rapidly. Each day delayed was a day's supplies consumed, a day later arriving in Oregon, a day longer imposing on this stranger's reluctant hospitality. "Isn't there another route to town?" I asked, knowing the answer even as the question left my lips. Hayes shook his head. "Not unless you want to add 50 miles and a mountain pass to your journey." "I see." I squared my shoulders, accepting what couldn't be changed. "Then we'll have to make the best of it." His gaze assessed me with something that might have been approval. "You take disappointment well, Mrs. Caldwell." "The past year has provided ample practice, Mr. Hayes," I replied with more candor than I'd intended. Something like empathy flickered in his eyes before he turned back toward the wagon. "Let's salvage what we can of your belongings. No sense leaving them to rot in the rain." Together, we unloaded the items most vulnerable to water damage. Our trunk of clothing, James's small collection of books, the family Bible Thomas had inherited from his father. Hayes worked methodically, his movements economical and practiced, while I sorted through soaked blankets and separated what could be saved from what was beyond redemption. "We can dry most of this at the ranch," he said, lashing our salvaged possessions to the backs of our mounts. "Anything crucial we've missed?" I scanned the wagon interior, now stripped of all but the heaviest furniture pieces and kitchen equipment. "No, the important things are accounted for." My gaze lingered on the wagon itself, our home these past months, the vessel meant to carry us to our new life. "I just hope it survives until we can repair it." "I'll ride out every few days to check on it," Hayes offered. "The frame is sound enough. Once the axle's replaced, you'll be on your way." On our way. The words hung between us, a reminder that our current arrangement was temporary, a mere interruption in separate journeys that would soon diverge again. With our horses laden with recovered belongings, we began the ride back to the ranch. This time Hayes led us on a different route, skirting the edge of a verdant pasture where fat cattle grazed contentedly, their red and white Hereford markings bright against the green landscape. You've built something impressive here, I remarked, noting the well-maintained fencing, the carefully positioned windbreaks of pine trees, the overall sense of thoughtful stewardship evident in every aspect of his land. Hayes accepted the compliment with a slight nod. My father chose good land. I've just tried not to ruin it. You've done more than that, I observed. This is thriving. He glanced at me, seeming to gauge my sincerity, then gestured toward a distant slope where neat rows of newly sprouted crops lined the hillside. Wheat there. Kitchen garden closer to the house. Miguel, my ranch hand, thinks I'm foolish for diversifying when cattle prices are good, but one bad winter or cattle disease could change everything, I finished for him. My father believed the same. Never put all your hopes in one crop or one herd. Your father and mine would have gotten along, Hayes remarked, the closest thing to warmth I'd yet heard in his voice. As we rode, he pointed out features of his operation, the spring-fed pond that never ran dry, the barn he'd expanded himself 2 summers past, the orchard of young apple trees just beginning to bud. Each detail revealed not just competence, but vision. A man building something meant to last generations, yet living alone amidst his creation. The contradiction puzzled me. A man with such evident capability and such a fine property would be considered a prime marriage prospect in any frontier community. Yet Hayes moved through his domain with the ingrained solitude of someone long accustomed to his own company. We had nearly reached the ranch house when Hayes stopped suddenly, pointing toward a section of fence that showed signs of damage. Storm took down part of the north pasture fence, he observed. I'll need to repair that today. The children and I can help, I offered. James would be delighted to learn fence mending, and even Emma can carry tools. Hayes hesitated, clearly unaccustomed to accepting assistance. It's not necessary, Mr. Hayes, I interrupted gently. If we're to be stranded here for a week or more, I'd prefer we earn our keep. None of us are strangers to hard work. He studied me for a long moment before nodding. Fair enough. Miguel could use the help, and I've other tasks needing attention. We continued toward the house, the horses picking their way carefully through muddy patches. As we reached the yard, Hayes dismounted first, then moved to help me down. As his hands circled my waist, I couldn't help but notice the strength in them, the sureness with which he lifted me, as if my weight were inconsequential. My boots had barely touched ground when I noticed them, ragged white lines crisscrossing the back of his right hand and disappearing beneath his sleeve. Scars, old but extensive, telling of some past violence or accident. Hayes caught my gaze and withdrew his hands abruptly, turning away to secure the horse's reins to the hitching post. Miguel can help unload your things, he said, his voice once again remote. The brief camaraderie of our ride vanished like morning mist beneath a harsh sun. Thank you, I replied, sensing his withdrawal and respecting it. Whatever story those scars told, it wasn't one he cared to share with a temporary visitor to his life. From inside the house came the sound of children's laughter, followed by the clatter of what sounded suspiciously like a dropped pan. Hayes and I exchanged glances, his alarmed, mine resigned. I'd better see what mischief they've found, I said, gathering my muddied skirts. Hayes nodded, already turning toward the barn. I'll bring your things in shortly. As I watched his retreating back, straight-spined and solitary, I wondered about the man who had reluctantly opened his home to us. What wounds did he carry that weren't visible on his skin? What history had shaped him into this competent, reserved figure who lived alone amidst abundance, clearly meant for a family? The questions lingered unanswered as I made my way to the house to restore whatever order my children had undoubtedly disrupted. We might be here a week or longer, I reminded myself. Plenty of time for the careful unraveling of mysteries, should Ethan Hayes prove willing to be known. After our return from examining the wagon, I set about making ourselves useful, beginning with the kitchen. The morning's breakfast dishes needed washing, and I'd noticed several organizational improvements that might make cooking easier. Still, I moved cautiously, reminding myself constantly that this was not my home, merely a temporary harbor from life's storms. I hope you don't mind, I said when Ethan returned from the barn, gesturing to the reorganized spice shelf where I'd grouped similar items together. I tried not to move anything too dramatically. He surveyed my work with an unreadable expression. It's fine, probably makes more sense than how I had it. Your mother likely had her own system, I ventured. I've simply grouped things by use. Baking supplies together, breakfast items on this shelf. A shadow crossed his face at the mention of his mother, but he nodded. She was orderly. After she passed, things fell into patterns that made sense only to me, I suppose. I've left your coffee where it was, I assured him. Some things shouldn't be tampered with, even in the name of efficiency. This earned me the ghost of a smile, just a slight easing of the lines around his mouth, but a noticeable change nonetheless. Appreciate that, Mrs. Caldwell. Sarah, I corrected gently. If we're to share quarters for a week or more, Mrs. Caldwell feels overly formal. He hesitated, then nodded. Sarah, then, he gestured vaguely around the kitchen. Make whatever changes seem sensible. You clearly know more about proper kitchens than I do. Before I could respond, Emma appeared in the doorway, her apron smudged with dirt from the garden. She'd spent the morning weeding the neglected vegetable beds, approaching the task with the seriousness she brought to all her endeavors. Mr. Hayes, she said, her voice carrying that formal politeness she reserved for adults she wished to impress, the garden has good soil, but there are so many weeds. Did your mother grow vegetables every year? Ethan turned toward her, his expression softening slightly. Yes, she did. Tomatoes were her specialty. She'd start them indoors before the last frost. Had a way with beans, too. Emma nodded solemnly. The bean trellis needs mending, but it's still strong. Was your mother a good cook? I opened my mouth to scold her for such personal questions, but Ethan answered before I could intervene. The best, he said simply. Never tasted better biscuits than hers, not even in fancy hotels back east. Emma absorbed this information with the attentiveness of a student memorizing an important lesson. Did she teach you to cook? Some basics, he admitted. Enough to keep from starving, though nothing fancy. My mom is teaching me, Emma said. She says every girl should know how to run a proper kitchen, even if someday she's wealthy enough to hire help. Your mama's right, Ethan agreed, glancing my way with something like approval. Emboldened by his willingness to converse, Emma continued her gentle interrogation. Do you have any brothers or sisters, Mr. Hayes? I can't imagine living without James, even when he's being troublesome. A slight stiffening of Ethan's shoulders was the only outward sign that the question had struck a nerve. No, he answered. I was an only child. My parents came west when I was young, just the three of us. That must have been lonely, Emma observed with a child's directness. Emma, I cautioned. Mr. Hayes has work to do. Let's not pester him with questions. It's all right, Ethan said, though his tone had grown more reserved. Children are naturally curious. He turned back to Emma. Yes, it was sometimes lonely, but there was always work to be done, and my parents were good company. When did they, Emma began, but I interrupted firmly. Emma, I believe the carrots still need weeding, and weren't you going to check if any early lettuce survived the winter? She accepted the dismissal with good grace, offering a small curtsy to Ethan before retreating to the garden. Once she'd gone, I turned apologetically to our host. I'm sorry, Emma has always been inquisitive, and recent events have only sharpened her desire to understand the world around her. No harm done, Ethan replied, though his expression had closed again, the brief openness evaporating like morning dew under harsh sun. She's a thoughtful child. You've raised her well. The compliment caught me off guard. Thank you. Thomas, her father, deserves much of the credit. He always spoke to the children as if their thoughts mattered. Ethan nodded, then excused himself to check on James, who was supposedly helping Miguel repair a harness, but more likely asking the patient ranch hand an endless stream of questions about horses and cattle. I returned to my kitchen reorganization, careful to maintain the boundary between helpful guest and intrusive presence. Each drawer I opened revealed small insights into the household. A mother's handwritten recipe cards tucked between the pages of a worn cookbook, a collection of polished river stones arranged carefully on the windowsill, a child's drawing preserved beneath a stack of clean linens. These glimpses into Ethan Hayes' history made him both more human and more mysterious. What circumstances had led him to live alone in a house built for family? How long had his parents been gone? Why had no wife come to fill the obvious void in his life? Such questions were not mine to ask, I reminded myself firmly. Our paths had crossed by chance, not choice, and would soon diverge again. I was placing the last of the dried herbs into labeled jars when a commotion from outside drew my attention. Through the kitchen window, I spotted James, racing across the yard, something clutched to his chest, with Ethan following at a more measured pace. "Mama, look!" James burst through the door, his face alight with excitement. In his hands, he cradled a collection of small wooden horses, exquisitely carved and painted in lifelike detail. "Mr. Hayes had these in a box in the barn. Aren't they magnificent?" I glanced at Ethan, who had paused in the doorway, his expression a complex mixture of emotions I couldn't quite decipher. "They're beautiful," I said carefully, "but James, did you ask permission before taking Mr. Hayes's things?" James's expression fell. I found them in a box when I was helping Mr. Miguel. I didn't mean to snoop, honest." "They're toys, meant for children," Ethan said, his voice gruff. "He can play with them if he's careful. They're old, though. Some pieces might be fragile." "Oh, I'll be ever so careful," James promised fervently. "I've never seen such wonderful horses. Did you make them, Mr. Hayes?" A shadow passed over Ethan's features. "My father did. He had a knack for carving." "He was very talented," I observed, examining the lifelike detail of a rearing stallion. "These are true craftsmanship." "He made them for," Ethan began, then stopped abruptly. "They should be played with, not gathering dust in a barn." I caught the hesitation, the unfinished thought. For whom had these toys been made? For Ethan as a boy? Or perhaps for another child who never arrived to claim them? Before I could ponder this further, the sound of an approaching wagon interrupted our conversation. Ethan moved to the window, his posture stiffening slightly. "Clara Wilson," he muttered, more to himself than to us. "Right on schedule." "A neighbor?" I inquired, smoothing my apron instinctively. "Yes, her place borders mine to the south. She's—" He hesitated, searching for words. "Attentive to her neighbor's welfare." Something in his tone suggested this attentiveness wasn't entirely welcome. I barely had time to smooth my hair before a knock sounded at the door. Ethan opened it to reveal a plump, pleasant-faced woman of perhaps 50, her arms laden with what appeared to be preserves and baked goods. Her shrewd eyes widened considerably at the sight of me standing in Ethan's kitchen. "Ethan Hayes!" she exclaimed, bustling past him without waiting for an invitation. "The rumors are true, then. I told Hiram this morning when the Potter boy rode by, saying he'd seen smoke from your chimney unusually early and strangers' clothes hanging on your line." "Mrs. Wilson," Ethan greeted her with resigned politeness. "Allow me to introduce Mrs. Sarah Caldwell and her children, Emma and James. Their wagon broke down in yesterday's storm. They're sheltering here until repairs can be made." Clara Wilson's appraising gaze swept over me, taking in my worn but tidy dress, my wedding band, and my general appearance with impressive thoroughness before shifting to James and his wooden horses. "How fortunate you found such a gallant rescuer," she said, her tone friendly but her eyes calculating. "Ethan here keeps to himself more than is healthy for a man his age, but he's got a good heart beneath all that gruffness." "We're very grateful for Mr. Hayes' hospitality," I replied, matching her tone of friendly neutrality. "The storm was quite severe." "Indeed it was," Clara agreed, depositing her armload of goods on the kitchen table. "Brought you some strawberry preserves from last summer's batch, Ethan, and apple butter. My Hiram says your pantry's probably bare as Mother Hubbard's cupboard, what with you being a bachelor and all." "Mrs. Caldwell has been kind enough to bring order to my kitchen," Ethan said, a hint of defensiveness in his voice. "We're managing fine." "I'm sure you are," Claire responded with a knowing smile that made me blush, despite myself. "Still, I thought these might be welcome." She turned to me with bright curiosity. "And where are you folks headed, Mrs. Caldwell?" "Oregon," I answered, keeping my tone pleasant but not inviting further probing. "My cousin has a homestead near Salem." "Oregon, my, that's a journey. Traveling alone with children can't be easy for a widow." I didn't recall mentioning my widowhood, but small communities had their own way of exchanging information. "We manage," I said simply. "Of course you do," Clara agreed. "But it must be a comfort to have a strong roof over your head, even temporarily." Her gaze returned to Ethan. "Speaking of comforts, my niece Rebecca was just asking after you Sunday last. Said she hadn't seen you in church for 3 weeks running. Ethan's expression closed like a door slamming shut. Been busy with spring calving. Too busy for the Lord's house? Clara chided gently. Or for a home-cooked Sunday dinner? Rebecca makes a fine roast chicken, you know. Takes after her mother that way. The atmosphere in the kitchen had grown noticeably strained. I busied myself arranging Clara's gifts on the counter, giving Ethan space to respond to this obvious matchmaking attempt. Please, thank Rebecca for her concern, he said stiffly. Perhaps when calving season passes, Clara sighed with theatrical resignation. I'll tell her, though the poor girl will be disappointed. 23 years old and not a prospect for miles. Except you, of course. She turned back to me with alarming suddenness. Unless you know of eligible gentlemen heading west, my Rebecca's quite accomplished. Plays the piano beautifully, makes the lightest pastry crust you've ever tasted. I'm afraid I don't know many gentlemen in these parts, I demurred. We've been on the trail for nearly 2 months. Clara nodded sagely. Of course. Well, should you encounter any suitable prospects in your travels, you'll remember my Rebecca, won't you? Such a lovely girl, just wasting away out here with no one but her old aunt and uncle for company. I'm sure she's charming, I replied diplomatically. Clara beamed, then glanced at the window where the sun's position indicated advancing afternoon. My goodness, I've taken up half your day with chatter. Hiram will wonder if I've fallen in a ditch. She gathered her shawl around her shoulders. You must all come for dinner before you continue your journey. Ethan knows the way, though he visits less often than we'd like. Ethan escorted her to the door with visible relief. Thank you for the preserves, Mrs. Wilson. I'll bring your jars back when they're empty. See that you do, she replied cheerfully, and bring your guests. I want to hear all about your journey west, Mrs. Caldwell. After a flurry of goodbyes and a final meaningful glance at Ethan that even I could interpret as, don't be a stranger, Clara Wilson departed in her wagon, leaving behind preserves, questions, and a tangible awkwardness. Sorry about that, Ethan muttered when she'd gone. Clara means well, but she's determined to see everyone paired off and settled. No apology needed, I assured him. Every community has its matchmakers. My Aunt Ruth was legendary in our town, arranged 6 marriages in 5 years, all still intact when we left. This earned a genuine chuckle from Ethan, the first I'd heard from him. The sound transformed his face, softening the stern lines and revealing a glimpse of the younger man beneath the weathered exterior. Clara's record is less impressive, he confided. 2 marriages, one already dissolved when the poor fellow fled to California rather than endure another Sunday dinner with his new in-laws. I laughed despite myself, surprised by this flash of humor from our somber host. Then I suppose we should be grateful she's focused her efforts on her niece rather than on us. The moment the words left my mouth, I regretted them. A flush crept into my cheeks as Ethan's eyes widened slightly, both of us suddenly aware of the impropriety of joking about such matters. I only meant, I began. Of course, he interrupted hastily. I understood your meaning. An awkward silence fell between us, broken by James's timely intervention as he held up one of the wooden horses. Mr. Hayes, this one looks just like your big bay horse. Did your paw make it to match? Ethan seized upon the change of subject with obvious relief. Good eye, boy. Yes, my father carved most of these to resemble actual horses he'd known. That one was modeled after my first riding horse, Thunder. As James peppered him with questions about Thunder's exploits, I busied myself with preparing our evening meal, grateful for the distraction from my social blunder. Yet as I worked, I couldn't help noticing how Ethan's responses to James grew more animated, how his hands moved expressively when describing his father's carving techniques, how a certain tension seemed to drain from his shoulders. In showing kindness to my son, opening this box of childhood treasures for a new generation to enjoy, Ethan Hayes had revealed more of himself than perhaps he intended. Beneath the gruff exterior and careful boundaries lay a man capable of generosity, even tenderness. The discovery both intrigued and unsettled me, for it made our temporary arrangement feel suddenly more complex than the simple matter of storm forest hospitality I'd believed it to be. Night fell early in the mountain valley, darkness settling like a blanket over the ranch, while lamps bloomed in windows like earthbound stars. With the children finally asleep after an evening of excited recounting of their day's discoveries, I settled in the main room with my mending basket. The rhythmic work of needle and thread always soothed my mind, bringing order to frayed edges, much as I tried to do with our disrupted lives. Ethan sat across from me in his leather armchair, a ledger open on his lap, making notes by lamplight. The fire in the hearth had burned down to comfortable embers that cast the room in soft, golden light. Outside, the occasional lowing of cattle and the distant chorus of spring peepers created a peaceful counterpoint to our silence. I was struggling with a particularly stubborn tear in James's trousers, the result of an ill-advised climb into the hayloft that afternoon, when Ethan cleared his throat. "I thought you might," he began, then stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. "That is, my mother's sewing basket might have better supplies than what you've brought." He rose, disappearing briefly down the hallway before returning with a handsome wicker basket, its contents neatly arranged beneath a patchwork pincushion. "Thank you," I said, genuinely touched by the gesture. "This is most helpful. My traveling kit is rather basic." "She was particular about her sewing things," Ethan explained, setting the basket beside me. "Said the right tools made all the difference between mending that lasted a season and work that outlived the garment itself." "A wise woman," I observed, examining the neat compartments filled with threads of every color, scissors that still held a perfect edge, and thimbles of varying sizes. "My mother said much the same, though I fear I've never matched her skill." "Your stitches look plenty neat to me," Ethan commented, nodding toward James's trousers in my lap. I smiled, surprised by the compliment. "Necessity has improved my technique. When replacing a garment means spending money we don't have, one learns to make repairs that last." He nodded understanding, returning to his chair but setting aside his ledger. For several minutes we worked in companionable silence, me with my needle, him apparently lost in thought as he gazed into the fire's glowing heart. "If you don't mind my asking," he said finally, "what waits for you in Oregon? You mentioned a cousin." "Martha," I supplied. "My mother's cousin, actually. She and her husband have a homestead near Salem. She writes that the town needs a teacher, and I have some experience from before my marriage." I hesitated, then added, "It's not much of a plan, I realize, but after Thomas, my husband, passed, our options narrowed considerably." "Teaching's honorable work," Ethan observed. "And needed everywhere out here." "Yes, though I worry about managing it while caring for the children," I admitted. "Emma's old enough to help somewhat, but James is still so young. In Illinois, we had family nearby, neighbors who'd known us for years. In Oregon, we'll be starting fresh." "Starting fresh has its advantages," Ethan said, his voice taking on a distant quality. "No one knowing your history, your mistakes." "Is that why you came west?" I asked, then immediately regretted the personal question. "Forgive me, that's not my business." "No, I was young when my parents brought me here," he replied, surprising me with his willingness to answer. "Barely 6. They were the ones seeking that fresh start, though I never knew exactly what they were leaving behind. Something in Pennsylvania that my father wouldn't discuss, beyond saying some men weren't worth the powder to blow them to hell." His lips quirked slightly. Pardon the language. "Sounds like there was a story there," I observed, careful to keep my tone neutral rather than prying. "I expect so." "Whatever it was, they found what they were looking for here. Built this place from nothing but timber they cut themselves and dreams they carried west." Pride colored his voice, warming it like brandy. "My father always said a man should leave more behind than he started with." "He succeeded in that," I said, gesturing to encompass the solid house, the prosperous ranch beyond its walls. "You've clearly honored his vision." Something like pain flickered across Ethan's face. "Tried to. War interrupted things." The simple statement hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken history. I kept my eyes on my mending, giving him space to continue or not as he chose. "4 years with the Union cavalry," he said after a long moment. "Came back to find my mother gone, influenza, and my father trying to keep the place going alone." "I'm sorry," I said softly. "Losing a parent is never easy, no matter one's age." "No, it isn't." He stared into the fire, his expression distant. Father held on another 3 years, long enough to see the ranch recovering, but not long enough to... He trailed off, leaving the thought unfinished. Not long enough to see all his dreams fulfilled, I supplied gently. Ethan nodded, his gaze still fixed on the dancing flames. How did your husband pass, if you don't mind my asking? Pneumonia, I answered, the familiar ache spreading through my chest at the memory. It took him in less than a week last winter. One day he was breaking ice on the cattle trough, complaining of a chill, and then... I swallowed hard against the sudden tightness in my throat. The children were devastated. Thomas was a wonderful father. I'm sorry, Ethan said, and I could hear genuine empathy in his voice. Children shouldn't have to face such losses. No, I agreed, though Emma and James have shown remarkable resilience. They speak of him often, which I encourage. I want them to remember him clearly, his laugh, his stories, the way he'd spend hours teaching James to whittle or listening to Emma read aloud. They're fine children, Ethan observed, a credit to both their parents. The compliment warmed me in a way I hadn't expected. Thank you. I worry sometimes that I'm not enough for them, mother and father both. That's part of why Oregon seems right. Martha writes that the community there is close-knit, supportive of newcomers. The children need more than just me in their lives. You're doing, Ethan said with a certainty that suggested he understood the weight of carrying on alone. Getting them to safety, to a future. That's what matters. Our eyes met briefly across the space between us, and I felt a current of understanding flow between us. Two souls who had faced loss and continued forward, carrying others' dreams along with our own. The moment stretched, unexpectedly intimate in its shared recognition of parallel journeys. I broke the contact first, returning my attention to my mending with cheeks warmer than the fire warranted. And you? Do you plan to stay here always? Where else would I go? He replied simply. This land is in my blood now. Every fence post, every field, every head of cattle represents my family's work. My work. He gestured toward the window, beyond which his ranch spread in darkness. A man doesn't walk away from that. No, I suppose not, I murmured, understanding his attachment even as I recognized how different our paths were. Mine uprooted and seeking new ground, his deeply anchored to a single place. We lapsed into comfortable silence once more. The only sounds the soft scrape of my needle through fabric and the occasional pop from the settling embers. I had nearly finished my mending when the bedroom door creaked softly. Emma appeared in her nightgown, her hair in a single long braid down her back. I'm thirsty, Mama, she explained, her voice foggy with interrupted sleep. I'll fetch you some water, I said, setting aside my sewing and rising. I'll get it, Ethan offered, already moving toward the kitchen. He returned moments later with a cup of water, which he handed to Emma with unexpected gentleness. Thank you, Mr. Hayes, she said politely, taking a small sip. James is snoring something awful. Like a baby bear, I expect, Ethan replied with the ghost of a smile. My father could rattle windows with his snoring. My mother used to say it scared away wild animals for miles around. Emma giggled at this, her reserve with our host melting slightly. Did you snore when you were little? I've never heard myself sleep, he answered gravely. But my mother claimed I could shake acorns from oak trees 3 counties over. This produced a full laugh from Emma, her eyes bright with delight at this glimpse of humor from our serious benefactor. I don't think I snore, she confided. Mama says I talk in my sleep sometimes, though. A far more ladylike affliction, Ethan assured her solemnly. Having finished her water, Emma handed the cup back to Ethan. Thank you for letting us stay in your house, Mr. Hayes, and for showing James your horses. He's been ever so happy today. Something shifted in Ethan's expression, a softening, a momentary lowering of the guard he kept so carefully in place. You're welcome, Miss Emma. I'm glad the horses are being played with again. After Emma had returned to bed, Ethan stood looking after her for a long moment, an expression on his face I couldn't quite decipher. Something wistful, tinged with a regret that seemed to reach beyond our current circumstances. He moved to the bedroom door, which Emma had left ajar, and peered in at my sleeping children. In the lamplight from the main room, I could see his features clearly, The hard lines of his face temporarily eased, his eyes gentle as they rested on the small forms beneath the quilt. James had indeed kicked off his covers, one arm flung dramatically above his head, his mouth slightly open in the abandon of childhood sleep. Ethan carefully pulled the blanket back over my son's shoulders, his large hand hovering for just a moment above James's tousled head before withdrawing without making contact. The gesture, both the impulse and the restraint, revealed more than any conversation could about the man who had taken us in. When he turned back to the main room, I pretended to be absorbed in my mending, giving him the privacy to compose himself. But the image stayed with me. This solitary man, surrounded by the trappings of family but living alone with his memories, reaching toward a child not his own, with a tenderness he seemed uncertain was his to offer. What dreams had Ethan Hayes set aside along with his father's carved horses? What might he have become if war and death hadn't altered his path? The questions circled in my mind as I finished the last careful stitches on James's trousers, but I knew better than to voice them. Some wounds were still too raw for examination, even years after their infliction. "It's getting late," Ethan observed, clearing his throat as if to dispel the lingering emotion of the moment. "I'll bank the fire before turning in." "Thank you for the use of your mother's sewing basket," I said, carefully returning the supplies to their proper places. "And for speaking with me this evening. It's been some time since I've had adult conversation after the children are abed." He nodded acknowledgement. It was pleasant. The simple admission seemed to surprise him as much as it pleased me. We exchanged awkward goodnights, each retreating to our separate rooms with much to ponder. As I settled onto the trundle bed beside my sleeping children, listening to James's impressive snores, I found myself wondering what the coming days would bring. We were stranded here by circumstance, not choice. Unwanted complication in Ethan Hayes' solitary existence, uninvited disruption to his carefully ordered world. Yet something had shifted this evening, some small seed of connection planted in the fertile soil of shared confidences. Whether it would take root or wither remained to be seen, but as sleep finally claimed me, I found myself hoping for the former, though I scarcely understood why. Chapter 3: Seeds of Spring. 5 days after the storm had stranded them at Evergreen Ranch, a rhythm emerged that surprised both Sarah and their reluctant host. The initial awkwardness of strangers forced into close quarters gradually gave way to something more comfortable. Not quite familiarity, but a tentative routine that allowed each to maintain their dignity while sharing the same roof. Sarah rose before dawn each morning, stoking the kitchen fire and starting coffee before Ethan emerged from his room. He'd grown accustomed to finding her at the stove, hair neatly pinned beneath a simple cap, the scent of fresh bread or biscuits filling the kitchen. Their morning exchange of pleasantries had evolved from stilted politeness to something almost companionable, though Sarah was careful never to overreach the boundaries of her position as temporary guest. "You don't need to cook every morning," Ethan had told her on the third day, though his plate was already cleaned of the eggs and bacon she'd prepared. "I enjoy it," Sarah had replied simply. "Cooking in a proper kitchen again is a luxury after weeks of campfire meals." The truth, which she didn't share, was that providing these meals gave her purpose, a way to repay his hospitality without damaging her pride or his. The confident movements of cooking grounded her when uncertainty about their future threatened to overwhelm her thoughts. This morning, Sarah had risen even earlier than usual to prepare a special batch of bread. Using Mrs. Hayes' heavy earthenware mixing bowl, she worked the dough with practiced hands, adding a pinch of dried sage and a sprinkle of finely chopped onion from the stores she'd discovered in the pantry. It was a recipe her grandmother had taught her, one that Thomas had particularly loved on cold winter mornings. The kitchen door swung open as she was shaping the loaves for baking. Ethan entered, bringing with him the crisp scent of early morning and fresh hay. His usual greeting died on his lips as he inhaled, recognition lighting his eyes. "That smells like," he began, then stopped, uncertainty crossing his features. "Sage bread," Sarah supplied, tucking the rounded dough into pans. "I hope you don't mind me using some herbs from your stores." "My mother made bread like that," he said softly, his gaze fixed on her flour-dusted hands. "With sage and onion?" Sarah paused, struck by the wistfulness in his voice. It's a common country recipe. I learned it from my grandmother. Ma made it every Saturday. Ethan moved closer, watching as she scored the tops of the loaves with a sharp knife. The whole house would smell of it all day. I can make something else if this brings unwelcome memories, Sarah offered, suddenly concerned she'd overstepped. No, he said quickly. No, it's good to smell it again. He cleared his throat. Coffee smells ready. Sarah recognized the subtle retreat to safer ground and allowed it, pouring him a steaming cup without further comment about the bread. As she slid the pans into the oven, she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Something between memory and present awareness, as if seeing her and someone else simultaneously. The moment passed as Emma and James burst into the kitchen with the energy only well-rested children could muster before full daylight. James carried a basket of newly gathered eggs, his face alight with pride. 6 brown eggs and 4 white ones, he announced. Mr. Miguel showed me how to reach under the hens without getting pecked. Well done, Sarah praised, accepting the basket. You're becoming quite the farmhand. Mr. Hayes, Emma said, her manner more reserved than her brother's but no less earnest. I've weeded all around the pump house and swept the front path. Is there anything else I might do before lessons? Sarah noticed how Ethan's expression softened when addressing her daughter. Over the past days, Emma's quiet industry had clearly impressed him, though he remained sparing with direct praise. Miguel could use help sorting seed potatoes in the root cellar, Ethan told her. If your mother can spare you from your studies this morning. Emma looked to Sarah with hopeful eyes. Though Sarah had maintained a simple routine of reading and arithmetic each day to keep the children's education from lapsing entirely during their journey, the practical education they were receiving at Evergreen Ranch held equal value in her estimation. Your reading can wait until this afternoon, Sarah decided. Learning to sort seed potatoes will serve you well when we establish our own garden in Oregon. Emma's face brightened at this permission, though she maintained her composure as she followed James back outside, instructing him on the proper way to close the door without letting it slam. As the children's footsteps faded, Sarah turned to find Ethan watching her with an approving expression. You're raising capable children, he observed. Most folks coddle their young ones too much for frontier living. Necessity is a stern teacher, Sarah replied. Since Thomas died, they've had to grow up faster than I would have wished, but they've risen to the challenges admirably. That reflects on their mother, Ethan said, the compliment delivered matter-of-factly but no less sincere for its lack of embellishment. Sarah felt a flush of pleasure at his words, though she busied herself with breakfast preparations to hide it. They are resilient by nature. I can claim little credit for that. Throughout breakfast, Sarah noticed subtle differences in Ethan's demeanor compared to their first awkward days. The rigid set of his shoulders had eased somewhat, and the perpetual furrow between his brows had softened. He even responded to James's enthusiastic descriptions of the barn cat's newest litter of kittens with genuine interest rather than the tolerant patience he'd initially shown. When Ethan excused himself to begin the day's work, Sarah caught herself watching his departure with unexpected awareness. In less than a week, this man had transformed in her eyes from forbidding stranger to, not quite a friend, perhaps, but someone whose approval mattered more than it reasonably should for a temporary acquaintance. She turned her attention to the bread, now filling the kitchen with its savory aroma. When Ethan returned for the midday meal, the first loaf waited on the table, its golden crust still warm. Sarah pretended not to notice when he took a second thick slice, then a third. But the small smile that curved her lips as she turned to the stove betrayed her satisfaction. Some languages were spoken without words, and good food had always been among the most eloquent. The following morning dawned clear and unseasonably warm, the kind of false spring day that teased of summer while winter still lurked in the shadows. Sarah finished the breakfast dishes, then stepped outside, drawn by the brilliant sunshine to explore more of the immediate surroundings than she'd yet had opportunity to examine. Behind the main house, a plot of perhaps half an acre stretched toward a small creek. Remnants of what had once been an orderly kitchen garden were still visible. Raised beds defined by weathered boards, a tumble-down trellis that had once supported climbing beans, several fruit trees showing the first blush of pink buds, But weeds had claimed much of the space, and many of the beds had collapsed from neglect. Sarah wandered through the overgrown paths, recognizing the careful planning that had once made this a productive garden. Whoever had designed it, Ethan's mother, she presumed, had understood the principles of companion planting and proper drainage. Even in its current state of disrepair, the garden's bones revealed the loving attention it had once received. The sound of approaching footsteps made her turn. Ethan stood at the garden's edge, watching her with a guarded expression. "This was your mother's garden," Sarah said, not a question but a recognition. He nodded. "She could make anything grow. Had the touch," my father always said. Sarah knelt, running her fingers through the soil of one raised bed. Despite years of neglect, the earth was rich and dark, crumbling perfectly between her fingers. She amended the soil properly. Good compost, regular care. This could be productive again, with some work. "I've kept it clear of the worst overgrowth," Ethan said, a defensive note in his voice. "Just haven't had time for proper planting these past years." Sarah rose, brushing soil from her hands. "Mr. Hayes," she said carefully, "would you permit me to restore some of these beds while we're here? The weather's turning favorable for early plantings, and it seems a shame to waste such good soil." She hesitated, then added, "I'd be happy to share whatever harvest might come before we depart." Ethan's expression cycled through several emotions: surprise, wariness, and something that might have been relief. "You don't need to do that. You're guests, not hired help." "I'd consider it a privilege, not an obligation," Sarah replied honestly. "I've missed having my hands in the soil. Our journey hasn't allowed for such luxuries." He studied her face, seeming to gauge her sincerity. "You'd be doing it for yourself, then? Not out of some sense of repayment?" Sarah appreciated his directness. "For myself, yes. Though I won't pretend I don't wish to contribute something lasting to repay your hospitality. Perhaps we could consider it a mutually beneficial arrangement." After a moment's consideration, Ethan nodded. "The tools are in the shed by the barn. Take what you need. And the seed box is in the pantry. Whatever survived the winter should still be good." "Thank you," Sarah said, pleasure warming her voice. "Emma will be delighted to help. She has quite the green thumb." "Like her mother," Ethan observed, his gaze lingering on her soil-stained hands. Sarah felt an unexpected flutter in her chest at the simple compliment. "We'll see if Montana soil agrees with my methods. Every place has its own ways." "The soil here forgives much if treated with respect," Ethan said, gesturing to the surrounding landscape. "My mother always claimed this valley had the sweetest dirt she'd ever worked." Her words, not mine. A smile touched Sarah's lips. "My grandmother said much the same about our farm in Illinois. I believe every gardener develops a relationship with their particular patch of earth." "Ma certainly did. She talked to these plants like they were her other children," Ethan said, the memory bringing a softening to his features. "Pa used to tease her about it, but he never interfered. Said her conversations with the bean plants produced better results than his lectures to the cattle." This glimpse into the Hayes family dynamic intrigued Sarah, but she recognized the fragility of such shared memories and didn't press for more. "I'll try not to disturb your work with excessive gardening chatter, then." "I wouldn't mind," Ethan said, then seemed surprised by his own admission. Clearing his throat, he added more gruffly, "The tools are yours to use. I need to check the north pasture." He departed with long strides, leaving Sarah to contemplate the garden and the complex man who had inherited it. Like the garden itself, Ethan Hayes showed signs of careful cultivation beneath years of protective overgrowth. The thought both intrigued and unsettled her. By mid-morning, Sarah and Emma had established their battle plan against the garden's neglect. Armed with hoes, rakes, and determined spirits, they began clearing the largest of the raised beds. James helped for a while, but his attention soon wandered to more exciting pursuits involving frogs by the creek, under Miguel's distant but watchful eye. Emma worked with the serious concentration that characterized all her endeavors, methodically removing weeds and sorting them into piles, those safe for the compost heap and those better burned to prevent spreading. "Mama, look," she called, holding up a small green shoot. "Some of the perennials are already coming back. I think this is mint." Sarah examined the fragrant leaves. "You're right, and that's thyme along the border. Your grandmother Hayes planted herbs that would return year after year, even without tending. She was wise, Emma said solemnly. Do you think she'd mind us working in her garden? The question gave Sarah pause. I think, she answered carefully, that any gardener would be pleased to see their work continued, even by strangers. Gardens are meant to grow and change. Emma nodded, satisfied with this answer, and returned to her weeding. As the morning progressed, she began softly singing hymns. First Amazing Grace, then Rock of Ages, her clear young voice carrying across the garden like a benediction. Sarah lost herself in the rhythm of the work, the familiar motions of preparing soil, providing a comfort she hadn't realized she'd missed during their long journey. There was something deeply satisfying about reclaiming this small patch of earth, seeing order emerge from chaos through the work of her own hands. So absorbed was she in her task that she didn't notice Ethan's return until Emma's voice faltered mid-verse. Sarah looked up to find him standing at the garden's edge, watching them with an expression that mingled surprise and something deeper, less definable. Don't stop on my account, he said to Emma, whose cheeks had pinkened at being overheard. You have a fine voice. Thank you, sir, Emma replied, ducking her head in a mixture of pleasure and embarrassment. Mama taught me the hymns. Your mother taught you well. Ethan's gaze shifted to Sarah, taking in the progress they'd made. 3 beds now stood cleared and turned, ready for planting, the soil dark and promising against the weathered wood of their borders. We found several perennials already returning, Sarah told him, rising and brushing soil from her apron. And the soil is excellent, just as your mother claimed. You've accomplished more in a morning than I managed in the past 3 springs, Ethan admitted, surveying their work. Many hands make light work, Sarah replied, and willing hands make it a pleasure rather than a chore. Emma had resumed her singing, moving to the next bed with rake in hand. As she began, Shall We Gather at the River, Sarah noticed something that caught her completely by surprise. Ethan, seemingly unaware, had begun to hum along under his breath. The moment held a peculiar intimacy that made Sarah's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. Here was this solitary man, briefly reconnecting with something long buried. Whether the hymn itself, the memory of his mother's garden, or simply the comfort of shared human activity, she couldn't say. When he caught himself humming, Ethan stopped abruptly, a flush rising from his collar. But rather than retreat into his usual reserve, he simply cleared his throat and asked, Will you join us for dinner? I've brought back a trout from the creek. Thought the children might enjoy something fresh. That's very kind, Sarah said, careful not to draw attention to the moment of vulnerability she'd witnessed. I'd be happy to prepare it. I'll clean it, he offered. My father insisted every Hayes learn to prepare what they catch. A wise policy, Sarah agreed. We'll finish this bed, then come help with the meal. As Ethan turned to leave, Sarah called after him, Mr. Hayes? He paused, glancing back. Thank you for the garden tools and the trust they represent. Something shifted in his expression, a small relaxing around the eyes, a softening of the perpetual vigilance he maintained. You're treating it with respect, he said simply. That's all she would have asked. He continued toward the house, leaving Sarah to ponder the layers of meaning in that simple statement. As Emma's voice rose clear and sweet on the chorus of her hymn, Sarah returned to the satisfying work of awakening this dormant garden, sensing that more than soil was being prepared for new growth in this unexpected season of their lives. A sharp wind swept down from the mountains on their 8th day at Evergreen Ranch, bringing with it a biting cold that belied the previous day's promise of early spring. The temperature plummeted as afternoon surrendered to evening, frost etching delicate patterns on the windows while the fire in the hearth struggled to warm the main room. Sarah tucked the quilt more securely around James, who had fallen asleep on the small settee after dinner. Though his cheeks were flushed with warmth, his feet remained cold to the touch despite the woolen socks she'd knitted during their journey west. He'll need an extra blanket tonight, she murmured, more to herself than to Ethan, who sat at the table examining his ledgers by lamplight. Emma, too. The children aren't accustomed to these mountain temperature swings. Ethan glanced up, his brow furrowed in concern. There should be extra quilts in the chest in the hallway. Mother always kept spares for unexpected guests. Thank you, Sarah replied, grateful for his ready solution. I'll fetch them now before it grows any colder. The hallway between the main room and bedrooms lay in shadow, illuminated only by the faint glow spilling from the kitchen lamp. Sarah found the cedar chest easily enough, its polished surface cool beneath her fingertips as she lifted the heavy lid. The scent of lavender and cedar rose to greet her, the distinctive fragrance of carefully stored linens. Inside, several neatly folded quilts lay stacked, each a testament to Mrs. Hayes's skilled needlework. Sarah selected two, a log cabin pattern worked in indigo and cream for James, and a delicate star pattern in faded pinks and greens that would surely please Emma. As she lifted them from the chest, her hand brushed against something solid tucked beneath the remaining linens. Curiosity prompted her to investigate. Pushing aside a final quilt, she discovered a leather-bound volume, its cover dulled by a fine layer of dust. Even in the dim light, she recognized the distinctive size and binding of a family Bible. Sarah hesitated, aware she was treading in personal territory not meant for her exploration. Yet something about the Bible's placement, hidden beneath layers of quilts rather than displayed prominently as most family Bibles were, tugged at her understanding of the Hayes household and its solitary master. With careful hands, she lifted the heavy book and opened its cover. The frontispiece bore an elaborate family record, inscriptions in various hands chronicling births, marriages, and deaths across generations. The earliest entry dated to 1781, Ephraim Hayes, born in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Subsequent pages recorded his marriage to Rebecca Miller in 1804, followed by the births of their children. Sarah traced the neat columns with gentle fingers, following the Hayes lineage through the decades. Ethan Benjamin Hayes, born 1838 to Joshua and Eleanor Hayes, stood out in handwriting she guessed to be his mother's, the same elegant script that had marked his father's birth 27 years earlier. Turning pages with reverent care, she noted passages marked with small crosses in the margins, Psalms primarily, but also sections of Isaiah and the Gospels. Many bore dates from 1861 through 1865, the war years. Someone, Ethan, she presumed, had sought comfort in these verses during that terrible time. The final marked passage, dated April 1865, was from the Book of Job. Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. The poignancy of that selection, made as the war drew to its bloody conclusion, tightened Sarah's throat with unexpected emotion. What had Ethan endured to drive him from the faith that had apparently sustained him through 4 years of conflict? Aware that her absence might soon be noted, Sarah carefully returned the Bible to its hiding place, arranging the quilts above it exactly as she had found them. She closed the chest and returned to the main room, the discovered family history adding another layer to her understanding of the complex man who had taken them in. Dinner that evening was a quiet affair, the wind's mournful keening around the eaves providing accompaniment to the clink of cutlery against plates. Emma, sensitive as always to atmospheric shifts, both physical and emotional, ate with unusual quietness while James peppered his meal with questions about whether snow might fall despite the calendar's insistence that spring had arrived. In the mountains, weather follows its own calendar, Ethan explained, passing the platter of venison to Sarah. I've seen snow as late as June up in the high country. June! James exclaimed, eyes wide with disbelief. But that's summer. Nature doesn't always concern itself with our names for seasons, Sarah explained, serving James another helping of potatoes. The almanac can predict, but the mountains decide. Speaking of calendar dates, Emma said with careful precision, Easter will arrive in just over 2 weeks. Will we attend church services in town, Mama? Sarah glanced at Ethan, uncertain how to respond. Their temporary status made presumptions about holiday plans awkward, yet Easter held importance for her family that she was reluctant to diminish. I noticed you have a lovely family Bible, she said, the words emerging before she could consider their impact. Is there a church nearby where services are held? The sudden stillness that descended upon the table was palpable. Ethan's fork paused midway to his mouth, his expression shuddering like windows against an approaching storm. There's a church in town, he said, his voice carefully neutral. Reverend Thomas holds services most Sundays, weather permitting. Might we attend for Easter? Emma asked, her gaze traveling hopefully between her mother and their host. The creek may still be too high for crossing safely, Ethan replied, his tone clipped. Best not to make plans that depend on unpredictable conditions. But Easter is the most important, Emma began. I'm aware of Easter's significance in the Christian calendar, Ethan interrupted, an edge entering his voice that Sarah hadn't heard directed at the children before. The weather doesn't make exceptions for holy days. James's eyes widened at the sudden tension, his fork frozen above his plate. Don't you like Easter, Mr. Hayes? He asked, with a child's innocent directness. James? Sarah cautioned softly. It's a fair question, Ethan conceded, though the tightness around his mouth suggested otherwise. I have no particular feeling about Easter one way or another. It's simply another Sunday to those with work that can't wait for religious observance. But the resurrection, Emma began, her voice small but determined. I believe I've had my fill, Ethan said abruptly, placing his napkin beside his half-finished meal and rising from the table. If you'll excuse me, there are accounts that need attention before morning. He departed with measured steps that nonetheless conveyed barely contained emotion, leaving behind a strained silence broken only by the wind's continued assault on the cabin. Did I say something wrong, Mama? Emma whispered, distress evident in her downturned mouth. No, sweetheart, Sarah assured her, reaching across to squeeze her daughter's hand. Mr. Hayes has his own relationship with faith, and it isn't our place to question it. Now, finish your dinner while it's still warm. Later, after the children had been tucked into bed with their extra quilts, Sarah found Ethan in the main room, staring into the fire with an untouched cup of coffee cooling beside him. The ledger he'd claimed needed attention lay closed on the table, its pen resting across unmarked pages. I've come to apologize, she said softly, remaining near the doorway rather than approaching the hearth uninvited. I shouldn't have mentioned the Bible at dinner. It was presumptuous. Ethan didn't look up, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. You found it in the chest. Yes, she admitted, seeing no point in denying what was clearly already understood. I wasn't prying intentionally. It was beneath the quilts. That's where it belongs, he said, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. Packed away with other things that have no place in daily life. Sarah weighed her next words carefully, aware she trod on fragile ground. Faith is a personal matter. I would never presume to judge another's path. Yet you wonder, Ethan observed, finally turning to face her. In the firelight, the planes of his face appeared harder, more angular, emphasizing the distance he'd placed between himself and the warmth of human connection. You wonder how a man raised with scriptures read at every meal could hide away the family Bible as if it carried contagion. I wonder about many things, Sarah acknowledged, but questioning is not condemnation. Each soul walks its own path with God. A bitter smile touched his lips, or away from him. Even that path isn't permanent, Sarah ventured. My grandmother used to say that faith is like the tide. It ebbs and flows, but the ocean remains constant. Ethan's expression softened fractionally, though pain still lurked in the depths of his eyes. Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman. Mine would have said something similar, though with more fire and brimstone attached. The small joke, unexpected amid such serious conversation, eased the tension between them. Sarah smiled, grateful for his willingness to step back from the edge of true anger. The children meant no offense, she said. Easter has always been an important celebration in our household. I know, Ethan replied, his voice gentler now. They're good children with good hearts. They deserve their traditions. He hesitated, then added, if the creek subsides enough for safe passage, I'll ensure you have transportation to town for Easter services. I won't have your family's observances disrupted on my account. Thank you, Sarah said, touched by his consideration despite his personal reservations. That's very kind. He shook his head slightly. It's not kindness, it's respect for beliefs that still hold meaning for you even if they've lost their savor for me. The honesty of his answer, its lack of pretense or justification, struck Sarah with unexpected force. Whatever had driven Ethan Hayes from his faith, It wasn't casual indifference or intellectual objection, but something deeply felt, perhaps deeply suffered. "Good night, Mr. Hayes," she said simply, recognizing that further conversation would only strain the tentative peace they'd reestablished. "Good night, Mrs. Caldwell," he replied, turning back to the fire as if seeking answers in its restless flames. As Sarah retreated to the bedroom where her children slept, she found herself wondering about the passage marked last in Ethan's Bible. "Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him." What slaying had Ethan Hayes endured that had finally broken that trust? And could such profound wounds ever truly heal? 3 days after the cold snap, rain returned to the valley. Not the violent cloudburst that had originally stranded them, but a steady, persistent drizzle that transformed the landscape into varying shades of slate and mist. By mid-morning, the yard had become a treacherous expanse of mud, and the distant creek had risen again, though not alarmingly. With outdoor work largely impossible, the ranch house felt suddenly smaller, its occupants confined within walls that had previously seemed spacious enough. James, brimming with restless energy that demanded physical outlet, had been redirected from roughhousing to quieter pursuits no fewer than 4 times before the grandfather clock in the corner announced the arrival of 10 o'clock. "Mama, there's nothing to do," he complained, sprawled dramatically across the bearskin rug before the hearth. "Mr. Miguel promised to show me how to throw a lariat today, but now we can't go outside." "What a tragedy," Sarah replied, glancing up from the shirt she was mending with dry amusement. "Imagine having to spend a day indoors with books, games, and a warm fire while others contend with mud and wet." James rolled onto his stomach, resting his chin on his hands. "Books aren't the same as throwing a lariat. And Mr. Hayes said I might help him check the new calves today." "The calves will still need checking tomorrow," Ethan observed from his position at the table, where he was working on what appeared to be a broken harness strap. "Rain's good for the land, even if it interrupts our plans." Emma, curled in the window seat with a book, looked up with thoughtful consideration. "When it rained at home, Grandma Caldwell would tell us stories about when Papa was little. She said stories make the time pass quicker than watching raindrops." Sarah's hands stilled on her mending, a wave of nostalgia washing over her at the memory of Thomas's mother and her seemingly inexhaustible supply of family anecdotes. "Your grandmother did have wonderful stories." "You tell good stories too, Mama," James said, sitting up with renewed interest. "But I've heard all of yours at least twice." "Such hardship," Sarah teased, setting aside her sewing. "To think you've exhausted the entire supply of stories in the world because you've heard your mother's collection more than once." "Mr. Hayes must have stories," James said, his gaze shifting hopefully toward their host. "Adventure stories about cattle drives and wild horses, and maybe even Indians." Sarah opened her mouth to chide James for his presumption, but Ethan spoke first, his tone surprisingly indulgent. "I might have a tale or two that would pass muster with a young man of your discriminating tastes," he said, setting aside the harness repair, "though perhaps not quite as wild as you're hoping." James scrambled to his feet, excitement banishing all traces of his former boredom. "Really? Real adventures that happened to you?" "Real enough," Ethan acknowledged. "Though you should understand that most actual adventures involve far more discomfort and far less glory than storybooks suggest." Even Emma had abandoned her book, moving to sit beside her brother on the rug before the fire. "Please, Mr. Hayes," she said with unusual animation. "We'd be ever so grateful for a new story." Ethan glanced at Sarah, as if seeking permission or perhaps reassurance. She nodded encouragement, curiosity stirring about what tales this reserved man might share. He moved to the armchair beside the hearth, settling into it with the air of a man preparing for an unexpected but not unwelcome duty. "Very well. Since you ask so politely, I'll tell you about my first cattle drive from Montana Territory to the railhead in Cheyenne." James's eyes widened. "How many cows did you have? Were there bandits? Did you have to fight them off?" "Patience, young man," Ethan admonished, though a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "A good story unfolds in its own time. Rushing it only spoils the telling." Sarah took up her mending again, dividing her attention between the neat stitches required to patch James's eternally torn trousers and the unexpected storyteller who had emerged from beneath Ethan's reserved exterior. "It was the summer of '67, Ethan began, his voice taking on a rhythmic quality that suggested natural storytelling ability long unused. 2 years after the war's end, and Montana was changing faster than most folks realized. The mining camps were booming, but so was the demand for beef back east. My father saw opportunity in those hungry cities if only we could get our cattle to the railroads. As he spoke, Ethan's posture gradually relaxed, the perpetual vigilance he maintained easing as he lost himself in memory. His hands, usually kept busy with practical tasks, now moved expressively to illustrate the width of river crossings or the steepness of mountain passes. His voice, typically measured and reserved, found new cadences, dropping to a dramatic whisper when describing a nighttime stampede, rising with genuine excitement when recounting the first sight of the Cheyenne railhead after weeks on the trail. The children were transfixed, James gasping aloud at the more perilous moments, while Emma leaned forward, her analytical mind clearly processing the logistics of moving hundreds of cattle across such distances. Even Sarah found herself drawn into the narrative, her mending forgotten in her lap as she envisioned the young Ethan Hayes facing these challenges alongside his father. When the last steer boarded that train, Ethan continued, my father clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Son, we've just taken the first step toward building something that will outlast us both." I didn't fully understand his meaning then, being more concerned with the silver in my pocket and the hot bath waiting at the hotel. Did outlaws try to steal your cattle? James interrupted, clearly hoping for bloodshed and heroics. Ethan's mouth quirked with amusement. The most dangerous outlaws we encountered were mosquitoes with an unnatural taste for Hayes blood, and one particularly determined badger that objected to our campsite choice. James's disappointment was palpable, drawing a laugh from Sarah before she could suppress it. Ethan caught her eye, a shared moment of adult understanding passing between them over the children's heads. However, he continued, refocusing on James, there was the night we nearly lost the entire herd crossing the Powder River. From there, the story evolved into a genuinely suspenseful account of a dangerous river crossing during unexpected high water. Ethan described the thundering current, the panic of cattle fighting against the pull of the water, and the desperate efforts of men on horseback to prevent disaster. By the time he reached the moment when his own mount lost footing and plunged him into the churning river, even Sarah found herself holding her breath, despite knowing the obvious outcome. The storyteller had clearly survived to tell the tale. "How did you escape?" Emma asked, her usual composure forgotten in the grip of the narrative. "My father," Ethan replied simply. "He saw me go under, rode downstream, and was waiting when the current finally pushed me toward the bank, caught me by the collar like a half-drowned puppy and hauled me onto his horse." The memory brought a softness to his expression that Sarah had rarely glimpsed. He never spoke of it afterward, never mentioned my foolishness in choosing the wrong crossing point, or the fact that he'd risked his own life to save mine. Simply said, "Next time, watch the water before you commit the herd." That was his way. "Your father sounds very brave," James said with reverence. "He was," Ethan agreed. "Brave and stubborn and wiser than I understood until long after he was gone." Something in his tone, a blend of pride and regret, resonated deeply with Sarah. How often had she reconsidered her own father's wisdom only after life had taught her its value through hard experience? "Another story, please," James requested, scooting closer to Ethan's chair. The afternoon unfolded in a tapestry of tales, some from Ethan's experience, others clearly passed down through generations of Hayes storytellers. He described cattle that demonstrated personalities as distinct as humans, horses that seemed to reason better than their riders, and landscapes so vast they humbled even the proudest men who traversed them. As dusk approached, Sarah noticed James's eyelids growing heavy despite his determined efforts to remain awake for just one more story. Even Emma's posture had relaxed, her head occasionally drooping before she caught herself. "I believe we've worn out our audience," Sarah observed softly, setting aside her long-completed mending. Ethan glanced at the children, seeming startled to find them half asleep at his feet. "So we have," he acknowledged, his voice holding a note of surprise, as if he too had been transported beyond awareness of passing time. "Perhaps they should rest before dinner." "An excellent suggestion," Sarah agreed. "Emma, James, why don't you lie down for a short while? I'll wake you when the meal is ready." With token protests but evident exhaustion, The children allowed themselves to be guided to the bedroom. Within minutes of their heads touching pillows, both had surrendered to sleep, the excitement of the day's storytelling having depleted their reserves more thoroughly than physical exertion might have done. When Sarah returned to the main room, she found Ethan still seated by the fire, his expression distant, as if part of him remained with the memories he'd shared. "Thank you," she said, reclaiming her chair. "You have quite a gift for storytelling." "I haven't seen James so captivated since his father last read to him." Ethan's gaze returned from whatever distant vista had claimed it. "My father was the true storyteller. I've merely borrowed his talent for the afternoon." "You do him credit," Sarah replied. "The children will remember this day long after they've forgotten the rain that caused it." A comfortable silence settled between them, punctuated only by the gentle patter of rain against the windows and the occasional pop from the fire. Outside, daylight was fading, though the heavy clouds made it difficult to gauge the exact hour. "What about you?" Ethan asked suddenly. "Surely you have stories of your own from before the children were born." The question caught Sarah by surprise, not because of its content, but because it represented one of the few times Ethan had actively sought information about her past, rather than simply responding to what she volunteered. "Nothing so adventurous as river crossings or cattle drives," she demurred. "Just an ordinary childhood on an Illinois farm. I doubt anything about you could be described as ordinary, Mrs. Caldwell," Ethan said, the unexpected compliment warming his voice. "And ordinary lives often contain the most meaningful stories." The gentle encouragement in his tone drew from Sarah memories long tucked away. Of summer evenings catching fireflies in mason jars with her sisters, of her father teaching her to guide a plow horse when her hands could barely span the reins, of her mother's prize-winning preserves that traveled all the way to the state fair in Springfield. As she shared these glimpses of her earlier life, Sarah found herself relaxing into the pleasure of remembrance. These weren't the carefully curated anecdotes she typically shared with the children, designed to instruct or preserve family history, but rather the small, meaningful moments that had shaped her understanding of the world. She described the lightning storm that had struck the old oak tree beside their spring house, setting it ablaze despite the pouring rain, an elemental contradiction that had fascinated her 12-year-old self. She recalled the traveling peddler who visited each spring, his wagon a treasure trove of exotic goods from distant cities and mysterious tales from his winter journeys. Most precious of all, she shared the memory of her grandmother's hands guiding hers through the mysteries of bread making, not just the ingredients and techniques, but the intuitive understanding of when dough had been kneaded enough, when the rise was perfect, when the loaf had achieved its ideal golden crust. She said you could tell everything important about a person by the way they made bread, Sarah concluded with a smile. Patient or hurried, generous or stingy, careful or careless, it all shows in the loaf. "And what does your bread reveal about you?" Ethan asked, his genuine interest evident in the way he leaned slightly forward in his chair. Sarah considered the question with unexpected seriousness. "I suppose it would show that I value tradition, but aren't bound by it. That I believe in foundation, but welcome improvisation when circumstances demand it." She laughed softly at her own analysis. "Or perhaps it simply shows that I'm a practical woman who knows good bread is worth the effort it requires." "All equally valuable insights," Ethan observed with the ghost of a smile. The conversation meandered like a stream finding its natural course, each story leading to another by association rather than design. As the room darkened further, Sarah lit the lamps, their golden glow creating an intimate circle that seemed to exist outside the ordinary boundaries of time. Ethan, initially reserved in his responses, gradually began to reciprocate with stories of his own childhood. Memories of his mother's garden remedies for every ailment imaginable, of his father's absolute conviction that the Montana Territory held opportunities no eastern state could match, of the family's arduous journey west when he was barely old enough to remember anything beyond impression and emotion. "My father was a visionary in his way," Ethan said, gazing into the fire as if it might reveal the man he described. "Saw this valley when it was nothing but unclaimed wilderness and envisioned the ranch it could become, not just a means to survive, but a legacy to build upon." "He succeeded admirably," Sarah observed. "Evergreen Ranch is a testament to his vision." And his stubbornness, Ethan added with a wry smile. The first winter nearly broke them. Game was scarce, supplies running low. Mother told me years later that she'd begun to believe they would die here, their bones discovered by the next foolhardy settlers to venture into this valley. What saved them? Sarah asked, drawn into the narrative despite its grim turn. The Flathead, Ethan replied. A hunting party found my father half frozen trying to track deer in 3 feet of snow. Brought him back to their camp, shared food they could ill afford to spare. When the weather broke, they helped him return to my mother with enough provisions to see them through until spring. The revelation surprised Sarah, given the prevailing attitudes toward Native peoples she'd encountered throughout their journey west. Your father must have been remarkable to earn such trust. He was, Ethan agreed. Though he'd have said the remarkable quality belonged to the Flathead, he never forgot that debt. Made certain I understood that a man's character isn't determined by the color of his skin or the language of his prayers. As he spoke, the firelight sculpted his features, emphasizing the strength of his jawline and the intelligence in his eyes. Sarah found herself wondering how different his life might have been had the war not intervened. Had his parents lived to see him fully grown into the man they'd raised him to become. Only when the grandfather clock chimed the hour did they realize how long they'd been talking, exchanging stories and memories like old friends rather than chance-met travelers. The children still slept soundly, dinner was long overdue, and the rain continued its gentle percussion against the roof. I should wake the children, Sarah said, reluctant to break the spell of their conversation, yet aware of practical necessities. Let them sleep, Ethan suggested. They've had excitement enough for one day. We can eat later or simply have a hearty breakfast in the morning. The casual use of we, the easy inclusion of her family in his planning, did not escape Sarah's notice. In just over a week, something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. The reluctant host and grateful guests had become something less defined, yet more connected. Not quite friends, but no longer strangers bound only by circumstance. Thank you for sharing your stories, Sarah said, rising from her chair. It's been a gift to see the valley through your family's eyes. Thank you for listening, Ethan replied, his voice carrying a warmth that had been absent during their first days together. It's been longer than I realized since I spoke of these things. Their eyes met across the firelit room, understanding passing between them without need for further words. Whatever tomorrow might bring, whether continued rain or clearing skies, whether progress toward parting or deepening connection, this day had altered something between them in ways neither had anticipated when morning dawned. As Sarah moved toward the kitchen to prepare a light supper for when the children woke, she found herself humming softly, a habit from happier days that had fallen silent during the difficult months following Thomas's death. The tune, half remembered from childhood, seemed to belong to this unexpected interlude in their journey, this unanticipated sanctuary where stories bridged the distances between separate lives and separate hearts. Chapter 4. Tender Shoots. 2 weeks after the storm that had first stranded them at Evergreen Ranch, the creek that separated them from town had finally begun to recede, its muddy waters retreating inch by grudging inch from the swollen banks. The morning sun glinted off its surface as Sarah stood on the porch, a basket of freshly gathered eggs balanced against her hip, surveying the landscape that had become unexpectedly familiar. Still too high for crossing, Ethan observed, coming to stand beside her. The morning light caught in his dark hair, highlighting strands of copper she hadn't noticed before. Another few days, at least, before the road's passable. Sarah nodded, unsurprised by this assessment. Montana's spring thaws followed their own timetable, regardless of human impatience. The delay is frustrating, but we're fortunate to have shelter. And I'm fortunate to have the extra hands, Ethan replied. Your boy has a natural way with animals, might make a cattleman someday. The casual observation sent an unexpected pang through Sarah's heart. James's future lay in Oregon, not here among Montana's valleys and mountains. Yet watching her son blossom under Ethan's quiet instruction these past days had stirred conflicted emotions she preferred not to examine too closely. He's always loved creatures of all kinds, she said, keeping her tone light. Even the most ill-tempered barn cat back home would eventually surrender to his persistence. Ethan's mouth quirked in a half smile. He's made similar progress with old Judge. The bull? Sarah asked, her brows lifting in surprise. The one Miguel said would gore his own mother given the opportunity? The very same, Ethan confirmed. Caught James feeding him apple slices through the fence yesterday. Beast was taking them as gentle as a lapdog. Pride mingled with alarm in Sarah's chest. He knows better than to enter the paddock, I hope. He does, Ethan assured her. The boy listens when it matters. That's more than can be said for most his age. He hesitated, then added, I thought to take him with me to check the north pasture fence line today. After yesterday's wind, there's likely repair work needed. Sarah tried to ignore the leap of pleasure in her son's eyes when Ethan later extended the invitation at breakfast. James nearly choked on his porridge in his haste to accept, his face alight with anticipation of this grand adventure. A gentleman chews and swallows before speaking, Sarah reminded him gently, and remembers to thank those who offer opportunities. Thank you, Mr. Hayes, James exclaimed, barely heeding the first part of her admonishment in his excitement. I'll be the very best helper. I won't slow you down or talk too much or... I'm counting on your help, Ethan interrupted, his serious tone belied by the warmth in his eyes. Those fence posts won't inspect themselves. As they prepared to depart after breakfast, Sarah found herself fussing more than the situation warranted, checking James's coat buttons, reminding him about staying hydrated, cautioning about keeping his distance from skittish cattle. He'll be fine, Mama, Emma said from the doorway, as Sarah adjusted James's hat for the third time. Mr. Hayes won't let anything happen to him, Sarah straightened, feeling slightly foolish. Of course he won't. I'm being ridiculous. It's not ridiculous to worry, Ethan said, leading his saddled horse toward them. But I give you my word I'll bring him back safe and sound. He turned to James. Ready, partner? James nodded solemnly, chest puffed with importance. Ethan swung him up onto the horse's back before mounting behind him with practiced ease. The sight of her small son settled securely before this tall, capable man stirred something in Sarah that wasn't entirely maternal concern. We'll be back by midday, Ethan called as they rode toward the north pasture, James already chattering animatedly, his hands gesturing with enthusiasm. Sarah stood watching until they disappeared beyond the rise, the morning sun warming her face while a more complicated warmth spread through her chest. 2 weeks ago, Ethan Hayes had been a stern-faced stranger reluctantly offering shelter from a storm. Now he was... what, exactly? Still their benefactor, certainly, but the relationship had shifted in ways she found increasingly difficult to define. You're looking at Mr. Hayes the way Mrs. Wilson looks at sugar candies in the general store window, Emma observed, coming to stand beside her mother on the porch. Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks at her daughter's unexpected perception. I was merely ensuring James was seated securely, she replied, more sharply than intended. Emma's knowing expression remained unchanged. You get the same look when Mr. Hayes explains about cattle breeding or shows you how the irrigation works, like you're hungry for something besides food. Emma Caldwell, what an inappropriate observation, Sarah scolded, though the flush deepening on her cheeks betrayed her discomfort with its accuracy. Mr. Hayes has been kind to us and I appreciate his hospitality. That's all there is to it. If you say so, Mama, Emma replied with the particular tone of a child unconvinced by adult denial. I think he looks at you the same way when you're not watching, especially when you're working in the garden or reading to us by the fire. That's quite enough speculation, Sarah said firmly. We have work to do. The garden beds need watering, and those carrots won't thin themselves. As they moved toward the kitchen garden, Sarah found her daughter's observations lingering uncomfortably in her mind. Had she been so transparent in her growing admiration for Ethan? The very idea sent a flutter of mortification through her. She was a widow not yet 2 years, a mother with responsibilities, a woman with firm plans that certainly did not include developing tender feelings for a Montana rancher, no matter how decent or capable he might be. Yet as she knelt in the freshly turned earth, coaxing seedlings toward the spring sunshine, Sarah could not entirely dismiss the truth behind Emma's words. Something had taken root in these days of unexpected sanctuary, something as tentative as the green shoots emerging in Ethan's mother's garden, yet potentially as enduring as the mountains that framed the valley. It was admiration, certainly. What woman wouldn't respect a man who had built such a life through his own labor, who treated her children with kindness despite his initial reluctance? But beneath that reasonable appreciation lurked something more complicated, more personal. A warmth that kindled when their hands accidentally brushed passing the coffee pot, a quickening of her pulse when she caught him watching her across the supper table, a peculiar comfort in his presence that she had not expected to feel with any man after Thomas. "Foolishness," she murmured aloud, pressing soil firmly around a delicate lettuce seedling. "Utter foolishness." Emma glanced up from her own planting. "Did you say something, Mama?" "Just talking to the plants," Sarah replied with forced lightness. "Your grandmother Hayes believed they grow better with conversation." But as the morning continued, Sarah found her gaze repeatedly drawn toward the north pasture, where she knew Ethan was passing along generations of ranching knowledge to her eager son. The sight that greeted her at midday, James perched proudly atop Ethan's shoulders as they returned, both laughing at some shared joke, tugged at something deep within her heart, some longing she had believed buried alongside her husband. It was admiration, she insisted to herself as she waved a welcome from the garden. Nothing more significant, nothing that would complicate their eventual departure, nothing that would survive their separation when the creek finally allowed them to continue their journey. Yet even as she mentally repeated these reassurances, Sarah knew that such feelings, like the tender shoots now emerging in the garden, had a way of defying expectations once granted suitable soil in which to grow. Late Thursday afternoon found Sarah kneading bread dough with particular vigor, working through thoughts she preferred not to articulate even to herself. The rhythmic motion, press, fold, turn, repeat, had always soothed her troubled mind, and today's concerns certainly qualified for such therapy. The creek's continued recession meant they would likely be able to travel within days. Their wagon axle still required replacement, but Ethan had assured her that once the road became passable, he would accompany her to town to arrange repairs. The very fact that this news brought a complex mixture of relief and regret troubled her more than she cared to admit. Through the open kitchen window came the sound of hoofbeats approaching, not the familiar cadence of Ethan's mount returning from the south pasture, but a different horse with a lighter step. Sarah wiped flour from her hands and moved to the doorway just as a lean, gray-haired man on a chestnut mare reined to a stop before the house. The stranger's clerical collar identified him before introductions could be made, though his well-worn riding clothes and trail-dusted boots spoke more of frontier practicality than ecclesiastical formality. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he called cheerfully, dismounting with the ease of a man accustomed to traveling long distances on horseback. "I'm Reverend Thomas, making my monthly circuit. Is Ethan about?" "He's checking the herd in the south pasture," Sarah replied, stepping onto the porch. "I'm Sarah Caldwell. My children and I are sheltering here temporarily while our wagon undergoes repairs." The minister's eyebrows rose in undisguised surprise. "Is that so? Well, bless my soul." He approached with hand extended, his weathered face creasing in a warm smile. "Delighted to meet you, Mrs. Caldwell. I must say, finding guests at Evergreen Ranch is unexpected as snow in August. Our friend Ethan typically values his solitude rather zealously." Sarah shook his offered hand, recognizing genuine pleasure beneath his teasing tone. "The storm washed out the creek crossing and broke our wagon axle. Mr. Hayes has been most generous, offering shelter until repairs can be made." "Has he indeed?" Reverend Thomas's expression suggested he found this information both interesting and significant. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, especially when they involve flash floods and broken axles, it seems." Before Sarah could respond to this cryptic observation, Emma and James appeared from the direction of the garden, curiosity drawing them to investigate the visitor. James carried a small wooden horse, evidence of his recent play in the shade of the apple trees. "My children," Sarah explained as they approached. "Emma and James, this is Reverend Thomas." "A pleasure to meet you both," the minister said, his kind eyes taking in their healthy appearance and comfortable manner. "You appear to have settled in well at Evergreen." "Mr. Hayes is teaching me about horses and cattle," James announced proudly, "and Mama and Emma fixed up the garden that used to belong to his mama." Did they now? Reverend Thomas glanced toward the kitchen garden, where neat rows of spring plantings now stood in what had previously been a tangle of weeds. I'd say that's an improvement Eliza Hayes would heartily approve of were she here to see it. You knew Mr. Hayes's mother? Emma asked, her natural curiosity overcoming her usual reserve with strangers. Indeed I did, young lady. A remarkable woman, with the greenest thumb in 3 counties, and enough determination to move mountains if they displeased her. He smiled at the memory. I see something of that same quality in your mother's garden restoration. Sarah felt a flush rise to her cheeks at this comparison. It was the least we could do to repay Mr. Hayes's hospitality. The creak of the gate announced Ethan's return, his tall figure silhouetted against the afternoon sun as he approached from the barn. Recognition, followed by something more complicated, crossed his features as he spotted their visitor. Reverend, he acknowledged with a nod that was respectful, if not entirely welcoming. Didn't expect to see you before next week's regular circuit. The Lord suggested I might adjust my schedule, Reverend Thomas replied with good-natured equanimity. Or perhaps it was Mrs. Peterson's rheumatism that suggested it. She was particularly eager for a pastoral visit, and once I'd traveled that far east, it seemed sensible to continue the full circuit. Ethan's posture remained guarded, though his tone stayed cordial. You're welcome to water your horse and rest a while before continuing on. Much appreciated, the minister replied, handing his reins to James, who beamed at being entrusted with such an important task. The boy seems at home with horses, he observed, as James led the mare toward the water trough with exaggerated care. He's a quick study, Ethan acknowledged, genuine approval warming his voice. The change in his tone when speaking of James did not escape the minister's notice, nor did the uncharacteristic softness in his expression. Children have a way of brightening even the most steadfast bachelor's domain, he observed mildly. Rather like spring flowers after a long winter. Sarah busied herself preparing coffee, sensing the undercurrents in this exchange without fully understanding their significance. The relationship between Ethan and the minister obviously had history beyond the usual connection between parishioner and pastor. Once they were seated around the kitchen table with steaming cups before them, Reverend Thomas turned to Sarah with a more formal air. Mrs. Caldwell, I'd be remiss in my duties if I didn't extend an invitation to Easter services this coming Sunday. The congregation at Promise Creek isn't large, but we're a welcoming community. That's very kind, Sarah responded, genuine pleasure warming her voice. We would be delighted to attend, assuming the creek crossing is passable by then. The water level should allow safe passage by Saturday if this weather holds, Ethan interjected, his eyes fixed on his coffee cup. I can escort you to town, though I'll likely need to return immediately to check on a heifer that's having trouble with her first calving. The excuse, though plausible enough, carried a hollow ring that suggested fabrication rather than necessity. Sarah noticed the brief flicker of disappointment that crossed the minister's features before his genial expression reasserted itself. The congregation would welcome you any time you felt able to attend, Ethan, he said gently. Easter especially is a time for new beginnings. A muscle tightened in Ethan's jaw, but his voice remained level. Some beginnings require more preparation than others, Reverend. Indeed they do, Thomas agreed, an understanding passing between the men that spoke of previous conversations on this theme. He turned back to Sarah with renewed cheerfulness. In any case, Mrs. Caldwell, we'd be honored to have you and your children join us. The ladies always prepare quite a spread after the service. We'd be grateful to attend, Sarah affirmed. It's been some time since we've had the opportunity for proper worship. Our journey hasn't allowed for many Sunday services. Faith finds its expression in many settings beyond church walls, Reverend Thomas observed. In kindness to strangers, in the nurturing of growing things. His gaze drifted meaningly toward the garden visible through the window, in creating home wherever one finds oneself. The simple statement carried implications that sent a flush rising to Sarah's cheeks. Before she could formulate a response, he continued with apparent casualness. By the way, Ethan, the church roof developed a worrisome leak during the last storm. Several of the town men have volunteered labor for repairs before Easter, but we're short on experienced hands for the steeper sections. Ethan's expression remained neutral. Miguel knows his way around roof work. I can spare him for a day if needed. Generous of you, the minister acknowledged, though his eyes suggested he had hoped for a different offer. though having the ranch owner himself show up might inspire additional volunteers. A tense silence followed this gentle challenge. Sarah found herself holding her breath, sensing the unspoken clash of wills occurring across her kitchen table. Something significant lay beneath this seemingly mundane discussion of church repairs. Something tied to Ethan's reluctance to attend services and the minister's determined efforts to draw him back to the congregation. James chose this moment to return from the barn, bursting with excitement. "Reverend Thomas, Mr. Hayes taught me how to check if a fence post is loose without pulling it all the way out. You just push it different directions and listen for a certain sound. And yesterday we found a newborn calf, and Mr. Hayes let me help make sure it was breathing right." The tension dissolved beneath the boy's enthusiastic recounting of his adventures. Ethan's features softened as James continued his catalog of newly acquired ranch knowledge, his small hands gesturing expansively to illustrate particularly important points. "He sounds like quite the teacher," Reverend Thomas observed, his gaze shifting between James's animated face and Ethan's uncharacteristically gentle expression. "Mr. Hayes says I'm a natural rancher," James announced with undisguised pride. "Says I've got good instincts with animals." "He does indeed," Ethan confirmed, ruffling the boy's hair with a casual affection that sent an unexpected pang through Sarah's heart. In that simple gesture lay a world of might-have-beens. The father James had lost too soon, the family Ethan had never formed. As James continued his excited recitation of ranch activities, Reverend Thomas watched Ethan with knowing eyes. Something passed between the men, a recognition perhaps, or a question silently posed and left unanswered. When the minister finally rose to depart an hour later, the afternoon had begun its gentle slide toward evening, golden light slanting through the west-facing windows. "I should continue on if I hope to reach the Wilsons' place before dark," he said, gathering his hat. "Mrs. Caldwell, it's been a genuine pleasure. I look forward to welcoming you and your children on Sunday." "Thank you for the invitation," Sarah replied warmly. "We'll be there, God willing and creek allowing." Ethan walked the minister to his horse, their conversation pitched too low for Sarah to hear from the porch where she stood with the children. Whatever passed between them appeared earnest on the Reverend's part and guarded on Ethan's, judging by their expressions and postures. As Reverend Thomas mounted, he said something that caused Ethan to glance back toward the house, toward Sarah and the children, with an expression that combined awareness and uncertainty in equal measure. The minister's parting look carried a weight of knowing that made Ethan visibly uncomfortable, his shoulders stiffening as he raised a hand in farewell. The Reverend tipped his hat to Sarah as he rode past. "Mrs. Caldwell, you've worked wonders with Eliza's garden." She would have considered that the highest form of respect for her memory. His smile widened to include the children. "And young James, I expect to hear more about your ranching adventures on Sunday." With that, he urged his mare forward, leaving behind a thoughtful silence that stretched until his figure disappeared around the bend in the road. "Nice man," Sarah observed as Ethan rejoined them on the porch. "He seems to know your family well." "He performed my parents' funeral services," Ethan replied, his voice neutral. "Been the circuit minister in these parts for nearly 15 years now." "He asked you about the church roof, didn't he?" James piped up. "Miguel says it leaks something terrible when it rains hard." "Did he now?" Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Miguel seems to have quite a lot to say on matters that don't concern ranch work." "Will you help fix it, Mr. Hayes?" Emma asked, her perceptive gaze assessing his reaction. "Before Easter?" Something in Emma's direct question seemed to touch a nerve that the minister's more diplomatic approach had failed to reach. Ethan's expression softened slightly as he met her serious eyes. "Perhaps," he said after a moment's consideration. "If the creek allows passage and the ranch work permits." Sarah found herself holding Ethan's gaze a moment longer than propriety strictly dictated, a current of unspoken understanding passing between them. The minister's visit had disturbed the fragile equilibrium of their temporary arrangement, introducing considerations of community, faith, and connections beyond the boundaries of Evergreen Ranch. As they turned to go inside for the evening meal, Sarah caught herself wondering what Sunday might bring beyond the Easter service itself. The creek's recession meant more than just access to town and wagon repairs. It meant decisions could no longer be postponed, journeys no longer delayed. Whatever tender shoots had sprouted during this unexpected interlude would soon face the test of separation and the harsh light of practical reality. Yet as she watched Ethan lift James onto his shoulders for the short walk to the house, his large hands secure around the boy's small ankles, Sarah found herself hoping that some growths, once properly rooted, might prove hardy enough to survive transplanting, or patient enough to await an eventual return. Saturday dawned clear and unseasonably warm, the kind of day that whispered promises of summer while spring had barely established its tenuous hold. The creek had receded enough for Ethan to cross on horseback the previous afternoon, returning with supplies from town lashed to his saddle, including the crucial iron parts needed for Sarah's wagon repairs. "We should be able to complete most of the work today," he announced at breakfast, passing the platter of hotcakes to Emma. "I've fashioned a new oak axle that just needs the metal fittings attached." Sarah felt an unexpected tightness in her chest at this news. The repaired wagon represented both liberation and separation, the ability to continue their journey westward, yet also the end of this unexpected sanctuary they'd found at Evergreen Ranch. "That's welcome news," she replied, keeping her tone light for the children's sake. "We've imposed on your hospitality far longer than anyone could have anticipated." "It's been no imposition," Ethan said, his eyes meeting hers briefly before returning to his plate. "Extra hands are always useful on a ranch this size." After breakfast, they walked together to the barn where Ethan had been crafting the replacement axle. Sarah had offered to assist, partly out of a desire to understand the repairs their wagon needed, but also from a less practical impulse, a wish to extend their companionship beyond the confines of shared meals and evening conversations. The barn's interior lay dappled with patches of sunlight filtering through gaps in the weathered boards, dust motes dancing in the golden beams. The sense of fresh-cut wood, leather, and hay created an aromatic tapestry that Sarah found oddly comforting. "It's a fine piece of craftsmanship," she observed, running her fingertips along the smooth curve of the oak axle Ethan had shaped. "You have a skilled hand with woodworking." "My father believed every rancher should master basic carpentry," Ethan replied, selecting tools from the workbench with methodical precision. "Said a man dependent on town craftsmen for every repair would soon find himself with empty pockets." Sarah smiled at the practical wisdom. "My father held similar views. He taught all his daughters basic repairs alongside my brothers. Said women alone on the frontier needed such knowledge even more than men did." "A forward-thinking man," Ethan commented, genuine approval in his voice. "Hold this steady, will you?" He positioned the iron fitting against the end of the axle, his hands measuring the alignment with careful attention. Sarah stepped closer, grasping the wooden shaft as directed. The proximity brought her shoulder nearly touching his arm, the clean scent of his soap mingling with the earthy smells of the barn. "Like this?" she asked, her voice sounding oddly breathless to her own ears. "Perfect," he confirmed, reaching for a mallet. Their hands brushed as he adjusted her grip slightly, the brief contact sending a ridiculous flutter through her stomach that she firmly attributed to the morning's strong coffee. They worked in companionable silence for several minutes, the rhythm of their cooperation smoothing any awkwardness. Sarah had always enjoyed useful labor, finding satisfaction in tasks that produced tangible results. Watching the wagon parts gradually come together under their combined efforts brought a distinct pleasure, one made keener by sharing the work with capable hands. "What awaits you in Oregon?" Ethan asked suddenly, breaking the quiet as he tightened a bolt with careful precision. "Beyond your cousin's homestead, I mean." Sarah steadied the wood as he worked, considering her answer. "Martha writes that the settlement near them needs a teacher. I taught before my marriage, and it's a skill that travels well." She paused, then added, "The children need stability after so much upheaval. A small town where everyone knows their neighbors seems the safest choice for starting over." Ethan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Teaching's honorable work. The children would benefit from having their mother shape young minds." "It's not what I would have chosen," Sarah admitted, surprising herself with her candor. "Thomas and I dreamed of our own land, a place the children could inherit someday. But circumstances narrowed our options considerably." Ethan's hands stilled on the axle. "Have you considered," he began, then stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. "That is, Montana Territory has good land available for homesteading, fertile soil, adequate rainfall in this valley. A woman of your capabilities wouldn't struggle to prove up a claim. The suggestion hung in the air between them, carrying implications neither seemed prepared to address directly. Sarah's heart performed an odd little stumble in her chest before resuming its normal rhythm. "I've limited funds for establishing a homestead," she replied carefully, "and 2 young children to consider. Teaching offers immediate security while I reassess our situation." "Of course," Ethan said quickly, returning his attention to the metal fitting with unnecessary focus. "It was merely an observation. The valley has been good to those willing to work the land, that's all." The conversation lapsed into silence again, though not the comfortable quiet of before. Something had shifted. A door briefly opened, then carefully closed again before either could step through it. They continued working, their hands occasionally meeting over tools or wagon parts. Each brief contact seemed charged with heightened awareness, creating moments when time itself appeared to suspend around them. Sarah found herself increasingly conscious of insignificant details, the precise shade of Ethan's eyes in the barn's filtered light, the small scar that curved along his left thumb, the careful gentleness of his calloused hands when passing her a delicate fitting. "You've done this before," Ethan observed as she competently held a brace while he secured it. "Most women of my acquaintance would consider axle repair beyond their sphere." Sarah smiled, grateful for the return to safer conversational ground. "Necessity expands one's sphere considerably. After Thomas died, I either learned to maintain our equipment or paid exorbitant sums to the local smithy. Pride is a luxury poverty quickly cures." A look of admiration crossed Ethan's features. "You're a remarkable woman, Sarah Caldwell." The simple statement, delivered without flourish or apparent intent, nonetheless warmed her more thoroughly than spring sunshine. Before she could formulate a response that wouldn't reveal too much of her pleasure at the compliment, the barn door swung open, admitting a stream of bright sunlight and the unmistakable silhouette of Clara Wilson. Ethan Hayes, are you hiding from civil company again?" Clara called cheerfully, before her eyes adjusted to the barn's dimmer light and registered Sarah's presence. "Oh, Mrs. Caldwell, I didn't realize you were occupied together." The slight emphasis on "together" carried insinuations that sent heat rising to Sarah's cheeks. She stepped back from the wagon axle with perhaps more haste than dignity required. "Good morning, Mrs. Wilson," she greeted, smoothing her apron with flour-dusted hands. "Mr. Hayes is kindly repairing our wagon axle. I'm merely assisting with the simpler aspects." "How industrious," Clara replied, her bright gaze taking in their proximity and the easy familiarity of their shared workspace. "Reverend Thomas mentioned encountering you here during his circuit, said you'd made quite an impression on the Hayes household." Her eyes twinkled meaningfully, the garden especially. "Mrs. Caldwell has a gift with growing things," Ethan said, his tone deliberately neutral as he wiped his hands on a cloth. "What brings you by, Clara? Something needed at the ranch?" "Can't a neighbor visit without an ulterior motive?" Clara asked, affecting wounded innocence that deceived no one. "Though, now that you mention it, Hiram wonders if you might spare Miguel for the church roof repairs tomorrow. Seems they're short-handed for the steeper sections." "I'll send him after the morning milking," Ethan replied. "Anything else?" Clara smiled sweetly, undeterred by his transparent attempt to hasten her departure. "Just thought I'd bring by some fresh-baked apple hand pies." She patted the covered basket over her arm. "The children might enjoy them before your journey onward, Mrs. Caldwell." "That's very thoughtful," Sarah acknowledged. "They'll be delighted." Clara's attention returned to the wagon repairs, her head tilting as she assessed their progress. "Will you be leaving us soon, then? What a shame, with Easter just tomorrow. The social gathering after services is quite the highlight of our spring season." "We'll attend the service before departing," Sarah assured her. "The children are looking forward to it." "Wonderful!" Clara exclaimed. "And you'll stay for the social afterward, of course. There's dancing in the afternoon." She glanced slyly at Ethan. "Even confirmed bachelors have been known to unbend enough for a reel or two on Easter Sunday." Ethan's expression suggested he'd sooner wrestle a mountain lion than participate in such festivities, but he maintained a polite silence that Clara cheerfully ignored. "My niece Rebecca has been practicing her piano pieces for weeks," she continued, seemingly oblivious to Ethan's discomfort. She plays beautifully, such sensitive hands. I'm sure she's very accomplished, Sarah replied diplomatically, fighting the inexplicable urge to step closer to Ethan as if physical proximity might somehow counter Clara's matchmaking efforts on her niece's behalf. Clara lingered for another quarter hour, her conversation skipping lightly from town gossip to pointed inquiries about Sarah's journey, plans to thinly veiled observations about how settled the Caldwell children appeared at Evergreen Ranch. Throughout, her sharp eyes missed nothing, not the way Ethan and Sarah maintained a careful distance after her arrival, nor how their glances occasionally met with shared understanding when Clara made particularly transparent remarks. When she finally departed, leaving behind her basket of admittedly delicious-smelling pastries, the barn seemed both more spacious and oddly emptier without her vibrant presence. "Clara means well," Ethan said after a moment of silence, returning to the wagon axle with apparent relief, though her methods can be overwhelming. "She clearly cares about her neighbors," Sarah observed diplomatically. "And her niece." A grimace flickered across Ethan's features. "Rebecca's a pleasant enough young woman, deserves someone with more social graces than a rough-edged rancher can provide." The statement, delivered with matter-of-fact certainty, nonetheless carried undertones that stirred an unreasonable satisfaction in Sarah's breast. Before she could examine this reaction too closely, Ethan handed her a wrench, their fingers brushing in the exchange. "Hold this fitting steady," he instructed, his voice a touch rougher than before. "We'll have your wagon roadworthy by nightfall." They resumed their work, the earlier, easy rhythm gradually returning. Yet something had changed in the atmosphere between them. Clara's visit had inadvertently highlighted possibilities and complications neither had fully acknowledged before. As the afternoon sun slanted golden through the barn doors, casting their intermingled shadows against the earthen floor, Sarah found herself working more slowly than strictly necessary, extending these shared hours of purposeful companionship. Each completed task brought them closer to separation, each repaired piece of the wagon representing another step toward parting. When their hands met over a handful of iron nails, neither pulled away immediately. For the span of several heartbeats, they remained connected by this simple touch, gazes locked in wordless communication neither seemed prepared to translate into speech. It was Ethan who finally broke the moment, clearing his throat and withdrawing his hand with careful deliberation. "We should check our progress against the wagon frame," he said, his voice carrying a gruffness that hadn't been present earlier. "Make sure the measurements align properly." Sarah nodded, unable to trust her voice immediately. As they walked together toward the stranded wagon behind the barn, she found herself acutely aware of the distance between them. Mere inches of spring air, charged with unspoken possibilities and practical impossibilities. The repaired axle would soon carry her away from Evergreen Ranch, from this unexpected interlude in their westward journey, from the man who walked beside her with carefully measured steps. The knowledge settled in her chest with a weight that couldn't be entirely attributed to responsible maternal concern for their future. Some repairs, it seemed, were considerably simpler than others. Supper that evening held a celebratory air, with the near completion of the wagon repairs representing both accomplishment and approaching farewell. Sarah had prepared a special meal, using the last of their preserved venison, supplemented with early spring greens from the garden and fresh bread still warm from the oven. "The wagon will be ready by tomorrow afternoon," Ethan announced as he passed the bread basket to Emma. "We can depart for town in the morning for Easter services, then complete the final adjustments afterward." "Will we leave right away?" James asked, his expression falling at the prospect. "Not immediately," Sarah assured him, noting the shadow that crossed Ethan's features at the question. "We'll need to provision properly before continuing our journey. Perhaps Tuesday morning if all goes well?" The temporary reprieve brightened James's countenance. "Good. I promised Mr. Miguel I'd help him with the new calf before we go. He says she's taking to the bottle now." "You've become quite the rancher," Sarah observed, her chest tightening at her son's obvious attachment to Evergreen and its inhabitants. The coming separation would be harder on him than she'd initially anticipated. "Mr. Hayes," Emma said, setting down her fork with deliberate precision, "James and I have never attended a proper social gathering. Will there truly be dancing after the Easter service tomorrow?" Ethan looked momentarily discomfited by the direct question. So I understand. I haven't attended in recent years, but the tradition continues. Do you know how to dance? James asked, wide-eyed curiosity replacing his earlier despondency. Papa used to dance with Mama sometimes, but he never taught me any steps. A fleeting expression of discomfort crossed Ethan's features. I learned the basics many years ago. My mother insisted every Hayes should know how to conduct themselves properly in social settings. Could you teach me? James asked, leaning forward eagerly. Just one dance? So I won't look foolish tomorrow? Sarah prepared to intervene, sensing Ethan's reluctance, but before she could speak, his expression softened in the way it invariably did when James made a direct appeal. I suppose a quick lesson wouldn't go amiss, he conceded, though I'm far from an expert. James's face illuminated with delight. Now? Can we do it now? Let's clear the supper dishes first, Sarah suggested, hiding her surprise at Ethan's willingness to accommodate such a request. Then perhaps Mr. Hayes might demonstrate the simplest steps. The dishes were cleared and washed in record time, James barely containing his excitement as the adults moved the furniture back from the center of the main room, creating a modest dance floor. Emma seated herself on a wooden stool, hands folded primly in her lap, her expression a mixture of interest and mild skepticism. The Virginia reel is commonly danced at gatherings like tomorrow's, Ethan explained, standing somewhat stiffly in the center of the cleared space. But it requires multiple couples. A simple two-step might be more practical to demonstrate. Show me, James urged, bouncing slightly on the balls of his feet. Ethan cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable as the center of attention. Well, you begin with a proper bow to your partner, he demonstrated with formal precision, and then take the proper position. His movements as he demonstrated the basic steps had a mechanical quality, his body held rigidly as he counted aloud. 2, 1, 2, forward and back, turn to the side. The stiff, overly formal demonstration struck Sarah as unexpectedly endearing. This capable man who could break horses and manage a ranch single-handedly, rendered awkward by a simple dance step. A laugh escaped her before she could suppress it. Ethan stopped mid-count, raising an eyebrow in her direction. I did warn you about my limited expertise, he said dryly, though the corner of his mouth twitched slightly. I'm sorry, Sarah apologized, her amusement still evident in her voice. It's just, you appear to be marching to battle rather than dancing. There's generally more fluidity involved. Perhaps a demonstration from someone more accomplished would benefit James, Ethan suggested, a challenge evident in his tone despite the polite phrasing. Perhaps it would, Sarah agreed, rising from her chair with unexpected eagerness, if you're willing to partner with such a critic. I believe I can endure it for educational purposes, Ethan replied, the formality of his words belied by the warmth in his eyes. Sarah moved to stand before him, suddenly aware of her calico work dress and practical braid, hardly proper attire for dancing. Yet, as Ethan extended his hand in invitation, such concern seemed trivial compared to the simple pleasure of movement after weeks of travel and work. Children, if you could provide our rhythm, she suggested, a steady clapping like so. She demonstrated the tempo, which Emma and James immediately mimicked with enthusiastic, if not entirely coordinated efforts. Ethan's hand settled at her waist, warm and steady through the fabric of her dress. Her own came to rest lightly on his shoulder, their free hands joining at the proper angle. The formal dance position brought them closer than propriety typically allowed, creating a small island of shared space amid the room's expanse. Ready? He asked, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. Sarah nodded, oddly breathless despite the simplicity of the moment. They began with the basic steps, Ethan initially maintaining his earlier stiffness. Yet as they continued, something in his posture gradually eased, the military precision softening into more natural movement as confidence replaced self-consciousness. You see, James, Sarah called, though her attention remained firmly on her partner. The steps flow together rather than standing as separate movements. James and Emma continued their rhythmic clapping, adding an occasional encouraging comment that faded to background noise as Sarah found herself increasingly absorbed in the simple pleasure of the dance. Ethan's hand at her waist provided gentle guidance through the turns, his strength evident yet carefully measured. "You dance well for someone who claims limited expertise," she observed as they completed a particularly smooth sequence. "Perhaps the partner makes the difference," he replied, surprising her with the candor of the compliment. They moved together around the modest space, finding unexpected harmony in their matched steps. What had begun as an instructional demonstration gradually transformed into something more genuine, the simple joy of movement shared with a compatible partner. During a turn that brought them momentarily closer, their eyes met with unexpected directness. The children's clapping, the crackle of the fire, the very walls of the ranch house seemed to recede, leaving only this moment of connection suspended in amber light. Something passed between them, recognition, possibility, awareness, that transcended the simple framework of a dance lesson. The moment held, stretched, trembled on the edge of transformation, then broke as Sarah stumbled slightly, her skirt catching beneath her foot. Ethan's arm tightened reflexively around her waist, steadying her with instinctive protectiveness. "Thank you," she murmured, stepping back with more haste than grace, suddenly aware of the children's watchful presence and her own flushed cheeks. "I think James has the basic idea now." "Can I try?" James asked, oblivious to the charged atmosphere his request interrupted. "Of course," Sarah agreed with perhaps excessive brightness, grateful for the distraction. "Mr. Hayes can show you the proper hand positions." She retreated to stand beside Emma, her heartbeat gradually settling into its normal rhythm as she watched Ethan patiently guide James through simple steps. His awkwardness had vanished entirely, replaced by the natural grace he typically demonstrated in physical tasks. "You looked very pretty dancing with Mr. Hayes," Emma observed in a whisper, "like in a storybook." "Hush," Sarah admonished gently, though warmth rose to her cheeks at her daughter's perception. It was merely a demonstration. Emma's knowing expression suggested she remained unconvinced by this explanation, but she mercifully kept further observations to herself. The evening continued with James practicing his newly acquired skills, eventually persuading Emma to serve as his partner while Sarah played a simple tune on the mouth harp Thomas had given her years before. Ethan watched from his armchair, his expression softened by the lamplight and the children's evident enjoyment. Later, after the children had been tucked into bed with excited whispers about tomorrow's Easter celebrations, Sarah found herself too restless for immediate sleep. She stood at the bedroom window, gazing out at the star-scattered Montana sky, her mind replaying moments from the evening's impromptu dance. The physical memory of Ethan's hand at her waist, the steady support of his arm during turns, the unexpected connection when their eyes met. These sensations lingered like phantom impressions on her skin and consciousness. She pressed her fingertips against the cool glass, as if physical contact might ground her wandering thoughts. A widow not yet 2 years, with responsibilities to her children and practical plans for their future, what business had she developing tender feelings for a Montana rancher whose life was rooted firmly in soil? Her own path would soon carry her beyond. Such foolishness benefited no one, least of all the heart that would bear the pain of separation. Yet as she finally lay in the darkness beside her sleeping children, Sarah could not prevent her thoughts from returning to those moments when the distance between two separate lives had briefly collapsed into shared rhythm and unspoken possibility. Across the ranch house, in his own room, Ethan Hayes lay similarly awake, his usual ability to find immediate sleep after a day's labor mysteriously absent. The ceiling above his bed held no answers to the questions circling his mind, no resolution to the competing instincts of self-protection and nascent hope. He had built his life around certainties, the predictable patterns of seasons, the dependable results of labor properly applied, the established boundaries between his solitary existence and the wider community. The Caldwell family's unexpected arrival had disrupted these certainties, introducing variables for which his carefully constructed independence had no ready equation. The memory of Sarah in his arms during their dance brought an unfamiliar tightness to his chest. How long had it been since he'd held a woman, even in the formal context of a simple two-step? The war and its aftermath had hardened him against such basic human connections, building walls that had served him well through years of solitary focus on the ranch's development. Now those walls showed unexpected fissures, hairline cracks through which warmth and possibility had begun seeping, despite his best efforts at containment. The prospect of the Caldwells' imminent departure should have brought relief, a return to the orderly existence he had so carefully constructed. Instead, it created a hollow sensation beneath his ribs that no amount of practical reasoning seemed able to fill. Tomorrow would bring Easter services, wagon completion, preparations for departure, practical matters requiring attention and action rather than this useless circular thinking. Ethan turned onto his side, forcibly redirecting his thoughts toward these concrete tasks. Yet as sleep finally claimed him, his dreams held the echo of clapping hands, the scent of lavender water, and the trusting weight of a woman turning in his arms beneath the gentle glow of lamplight.